At my grandfather's will, reading my family actually popped champagne. They were celebrating his death because of the millions each of them had just inherited. While my parents and my golden child sister bragged about their new commercial high-rises and massive cash payouts, the lawyer slid a single yellowed envelope across the mahogany table to me. Inside was nothing but a 10-digit phone number. My brother-in-law laughed in my face and told me it was probably the hotline for a homeless shelter. But when I walked out to the parking lot and dialed that number, a sharp voice answered on the first ring. "I have been waiting for your call, Heir. My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant uncovering financial fraud. Before I tell you how a single phone call handed me the ultimate power to destroy my family's greedy empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the family scapegoat who proved everyone wrong." The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoing through a law office is a sound I will never forget. It was entirely inappropriate for a reading of a last will and testament, but my parents, Richard and Patricia Carmichael, had never let basic decency get in the way of celebrating new wealth. We were sitting around a massive mahogany table in downtown Seattle, formally gathered to finalize the estate of my late grandfather. The man had barely been in the ground for a week, yet my family was acting like they had just won the lottery. My parents were what you would call new money snobs. They cared exclusively about status image and appearing wealthier than everyone else in their country club. They had raised my older sister and me with two very different sets of rules. My sister Brittany, who is 35 years old, was the undisputed golden child. She was groomed to marry well, spend lavishly, and maintain the family aesthetic. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. Because I chose a practical career path instead of hunting for a wealthy husband, they labeled me the boring salary worker. They constantly mocked my profession, telling their friends that I just counted other people's pennies for a living. Sitting next to Brittany at the mahogany table was her husband, Jamal Washington. Jamal was an African-American hedge fund manager who carried himself with the kind of flashy arrogance that always made my skin crawl. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my car, a heavy gold Rolex, and a smug expression that never seemed to leave his face. Jamal was exactly the kind of man my parents adored. He talked a big game about high-yield investments and venture capital, and my parents hung on to his every word. As a forensic accountant, my entire job revolves around spotting financial liars, and my instincts had always told me Jamal was exactly that. But in this family, my analytical mind was considered a character flaw. The estate lawyer, a serious-looking man who clearly disapproved of the champagne flutes on his table, cleared his throat to regain control of the room. He adjusted his glasses and continued reading through the thick stack of legal documents. To Richard and Patricia Carmichael, the lawyer announced the estate leaves the sum of $2 million in liquid assets along with the residential estate in the suburbs. My mother squealed with delight, clutching her chest as if she had just won an Oscar. My father nodded approvingly, already calculating how he would show off this new windfall to his golf buddies. The lawyer turned the page. To my granddaughter Brittany and her husband Jamal Washington, the estate leaves the sum of $5 million in cash along with full ownership of 3 commercial high-rise buildings located in the downtown financial district. Brittany practically jumped out of her seat. She threw her arms around Jamal, kissing him deeply, while he leaned back in his leather chair, looking like the king of the world. $5 million cash and 3 commercial buildings, Jamal bragged loudly, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Looks like we are upgrading the yacht this summer, babe. Those buildings are prime real estate. I will leverage them for my next hedge fund project by the end of the month." I sat quietly at the far end of the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I felt no jealousy over the money, only a profound sadness that my grandfather's life was being reduced to real estate portfolios and luxury purchases by people who barely visited him during his final years. My grandfather and I had shared a quiet, unspoken bond. He was a shrewd, self-made businessman who respected hard work and integrity. He used to tell me that my sharp eyes and logical mind were my greatest assets. I knew he loved me, which was why the lawyer's next move felt so incredibly surreal. The lawyer turned to the final page of the document. The room suddenly grew quiet. the sound of clinking glasses stopping as everyone turned to look at me. They were eagerly waiting to hear what the family disappointment would receive. And finally, to my granddaughter Cassidy Carmichael, the lawyer said, his voice dropping slightly. The estate leaves this envelope. The lawyer slid a single slightly yellowed envelope across the polished mahogany wood. It came to a stop right in front of me. There was no mention of cash. There was no mention of property stocks or investments, just the envelope. Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence. An envelope, she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. What did Grandpa leave you, a coupon for a free coffee? I ignored her, picking up the envelope with steady hands. I broke the seal and pulled out a small piece of heavy cardstock. There was no letter. There was no final message of love. There was only a 10-digit phone number printed in crisp black ink. Jamal leaned over, trying to get a look at the paper. He barked out a harsh, arrogant laugh. Did Grandpa leave you the hotline for a homeless shelter? You are going to need it since that boring accountant's salary can barely cover your rent. Maybe they will give you a discount if you tell them you are related to us. The cruelty of his words hung in the air, but neither of my parents stepped in to defend me. Instead, my father gave me a stern warning glare. Do not look so ungrateful, Cassidy. My father chided, his tone laced with irritation. Your grandfather had his reasons. You have always been difficult and independent. You chose your own path away from this family's standards. Do not sit there pouting and ruin this family moment for the rest of us. We have a lot to celebrate today. They expected me to cry. They wanted me to throw a tantrum, to beg for a share of their wealth, to finally admit that I was the inferior daughter who had failed at life. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me break. But I did not cry. My forensic accountant brain was already processing the situation. My grandfather was a brilliant, calculated man who never did anything without a strategic reason. He despised my parents' superficial greed, and he saw right through Jamal's flashy facade. If he left them millions in assets and left me only a phone number, it was not because he loved them more. It was because the envelope contained something far more valuable than cash. I stood up slowly, picking up my purse. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table, right next to their champagne bottle. Tip for your terrible acting, I said, my voice ice cold and perfectly steady. Enjoy the real estate, Jamal. Try not to bankrupt it before the ink dries. I did not wait for their outraged responses. I turned my back on them and walked out of the law office, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. As I stepped out of the building and into the cool Seattle air, I pulled out the piece of cardstock. I walked to my car in the parking lot, took a deep breath, and dialed the 10-digit number. It rang exactly one time before a sharp, older male voice answered. I have been waiting for your call, Heir. My car is at the corner. I looked up from my phone screen and scanned the busy downtown intersection. A sleek midnight black town car sat idling silently next to a fire hydrant just half a block away. The rear door swung open automatically as I approached. I slid into the plush leather interior, and the heavy door thudded shut behind me, sealing me inside a soundproof vault of luxury. Sitting across from me was a man in his early 60s. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed old Wall Street money and quiet authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his dark eyes held the same sharp, calculating gleam my grandfather used to have whenever he examined a quarterly earnings report. Cassidy Carmichael, he said, extending a firm hand. I am Elias Thorne. I served as your grandfather's private wealth manager for the last 3 decades, completely off the books, naturally. I shook his hand, while my forensic accounting instincts immediately kicked into high gear. My grandfather never mentioned you, Mr. Thorne, and he certainly never mentioned hiding assets from his own estate lawyers. Elias smiled a predatory, knowing smile. Your grandfather was a brilliant tactician, Cassidy. He knew exactly what kind of vultures he was raising. Richard and Patricia have been circling his wealth for years, waiting for him to die. Your sister Brittany and that flashy hedge fund husband of hers simply accelerated the greed. Your grandfather needed a contingency plan to protect his true empire from being squandered. You are that plan. Elias reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a high-end iPad, sliding it across the center console toward me. Take a look at the real estate portfolio your family just popped champagne over. I took the tablet. The screen displayed a highly secured encrypted financial portal containing a complex web of balance sheets, property deeds, and liability reports. I swiped through the first few pages, my eyes rapidly scanning the rows of data. It took my professionally trained brain exactly 10 seconds to spot the glaring red flags. The numbers were disastrous. These commercial high-rises, I said, zooming in on a specific liability column. They are incredibly toxic assets. The debt-to-equity ratio is completely inverted. Someone has been taking out massive secondary mortgages against these properties for the last 10 years. Elias nodded approvingly, tapping his finger on his knee. Exactly right. Your father, Richard, has a very expensive country club lifestyle to maintain. Whenever he needed a quick million to buy a new sports car or cover a bad private investment, he secretly leveraged your grandfather's buildings. He thought he was being clever, using obscure shell companies to hide the paper trail from the rest of the family. And Jamal, I murmured, pulling up the cross-referenced accounts linked to my brother-in-law. Jamal is using these same over-leveraged buildings as collateral for his new hedge fund projects. He is building a financial house of cards on a foundation of massive hidden debt. If the market shifts, even a fraction of a percent, he will trigger a massive margin call that will bankrupt the entire family overnight. A margin call they cannot possibly cover, Elias confirmed, leaning back into the leather seat. Your family just inherited $5 million in cash, but they also inherited $40 million in hidden liabilities. The moment the creditors call in those loans, they will lose the commercial buildings, the cash, the suburban estate, and every luxury asset they possess. They are legally and financially ruined. They just do not know it yet. I stared at the glowing iPad screen, feeling a cold sense of absolute awe at my grandfather's strategic genius. He had handed them exactly what they wanted, knowing it would be their ultimate undoing. But a question still lingered. So why did he leave me a phone number, I asked, looking up at Elias. Why am I sitting in this car instead of watching them self-destruct from a distance? Elias reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black titanium card. He held it out to me. Because your grandfather did not leave you cash, Cassidy. He left you absolute power. He legally transferred ownership of his private holding company to you 3 months before he passed away. You are now the sole owner and chief executive officer of the Vanguard Trust. I stared at the black card, my mind racing through the corporate structures I had just reviewed on the tablet. The name Vanguard Trust had appeared multiple times in the liability columns of my father's hidden loans. Wait, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper as the sheer magnitude of the realization hit me. Vanguard Trust. That is the shadow holding company holding the secondary mortgages. That is the financial entity that issued the loans to my father. Precisely, Elias said, a dangerous grin spreading across his face. Your grandfather bought up all of Richard's secret debt years ago. He consolidated every single loan under Vanguard Trust. And as of this morning, Vanguard Trust belongs entirely to you. You do not just own a wealthy company, Cassidy. You own their debt. You hold the promissory notes on those 3 commercial buildings. You hold the financial leverage on Jamal's highly illegal hedge fund maneuvers. You are their ultimate creditor. With a single signature, you can freeze their assets, call in the loans, and legally seize every single thing they own. I sat back against the seat, letting the beautiful, ruthless reality of the situation wash over me. My family thought they had won. They thought they had finally discarded the boring salary worker who refused to play their superficial games. They had mocked my career, humiliated me at the reading, and told me to go find a homeless shelter. They had absolutely no idea they were celebrating inside a financial cage, and my grandfather had just handed me the master key to the locks. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was the executioner. The heavy, satisfying silence inside the town car was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. I pulled it out of my purse. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name, Patricia. I looked at Elias, who simply crossed his arms and gestured for me to answer it. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Hello, Mother, I said, my voice perfectly neutral. Cassidy. Listen to me carefully, Patricia barked, not even bothering with a basic greeting. Her voice was shrill with her usual demanding entitlement. Your father and I are hosting a massive inheritance celebration dinner this Friday at the Prime Steakhouse downtown. We are inviting all of our country club friends and Jamal's high net worth investors to celebrate our new commercial properties. Congratulations, I replied dryly. Why are you calling me? Because you need to pay for the catering, she demanded, her tone completely detached from reality. Since your grandfather clearly felt you did not deserve a real inheritance, the least you can do is contribute to the family that kept a roof over your head for 18 years. The catering bill is $50,000. I expect you to take out a personal loan and transfer the funds to my account by tomorrow morning. Brittany is used to a certain lifestyle, and we cannot have you embarrassing us in front of Jamal's investors by being a cheapskate. Consider it your duty. I held the phone slightly away from my ear as Patricia's voice echoed in the quiet luxury of the town car. $50,000 for a steakhouse dinner. She was demanding I take out a personal loan at a crippling interest rate just to fund a single evening of performative wealth. Mother, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. You are asking me to finance a party celebrating the assets you just inherited. Assets that you claim are worth millions. If you and Richard are so wealthy now, why do you need me to pay the catering bill? Patricia scoffed sharply, the sound grating against the phone speaker. That is exactly the kind of small-minded thinking that got you cut out of the will, Cassidy. Wealth is about liquidity and presentation. Your father and Jamal are tying up the cash in high-yield investments, so we cannot just liquidate it for a party. Besides, we fed and housed you for 18 years. We paid for your braces. We tolerated your rebellious phase when you refused to study corporate law and chose that mind-numbing accounting path instead. I looked over at Elias. He was watching me with an expression of quiet amusement, taking a slow sip from a crystal tumbler of water. I could feel the cold, heavy titanium of the Vanguard Trust card resting in my palm. Brittany is used to a certain lifestyle, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. She and Jamal need to project success. Since Grandpa gave you absolutely nothing, the least you can do is take out a loan to honor his memory by supporting the family. You owe us this. You owe your sister this. We cannot have you embarrassing us in front of Jamal's investors by being a cheapskate. Consider it your duty as a Carmichael. The irony was almost suffocating. My mother was begging me to ruin my own credit score to impress her friends, completely unaware that she was speaking to the billionaire who held the mortgage on her entire life. She was using the man whose company I just inherited as a weapon to gaslight me into submission. I will not be transferring $50,000 to your account, I stated clearly, my tone dropping the temperature in the car by 10 degrees. I will not be taking out a personal loan to fund your social climbing. However, I will happily attend the inheritance celebration this Friday. I would not miss Jamal introducing his new investors to the world for anything. The line went dead silent for 2 full seconds before Patricia exploded. Excuse me. You are not coming to this dinner if you do not pay your share. You will just sit there in one of your cheap off-the-rack suits glaring at everyone and embarrass your sister. Jamal is bringing heavy hitters from Wall Street, men who handle real money. If you do not transfer those funds by tomorrow morning, I will make sure security turns you away at the door. You are uninvited. If security turns me away at the door, Mother, I will stand on the sidewalk outside the steakhouse and loudly announce to Jamal's heavy hitters that the wealthy Carmichael family is begging their disinherited daughter for catering money, I replied. My tone was light, almost conversational, but it carried a lethal edge she had never heard from me before. I am sure hedge fund investors would love to know that their brilliant manager cannot even cover the cost of a shrimp cocktail. I will see you on Friday at 8. I pressed the end call button before she could scream another word. I tossed the phone onto the leather seat beside me. The silence in the car returned thick and deeply satisfying. I let out a long breath, feeling the residual adrenaline of standing up to my mother wash over me. For 33 years, a conversation like that would have ended with me apologizing, internalizing her cruel words, and emptying my savings account to buy her temporary approval. Not today. Today, I was the one holding the leash. Elias let out a low, rumbling chuckle. He tapped the armrest of his seat. Your grandfather always said you had a spine of pure steel, Cassidy. He just worried it would take a betrayal of this magnitude to finally make you use it. They have always been greedy, I said, looking out the tinted window as the Seattle skyline blurred past. But asking me to go into debt to fund a party celebrating my own disinheritance, that is a new level of sociopathy even for them. It is not sociopathy, it is desperation, Elias corrected smoothly. Your mother does not understand the balance sheets, but she feels the financial pressure your father brings home every night. Richard is bleeding cash to cover the exorbitant interest payments on the secret loans he took out against those commercial buildings. Jamal is bleeding cash trying to project the image of a successful hedge fund manager to lure in fresh capital. They are drowning in their own deceit and the water is rising fast. Elias reached down to the floorboard and retrieved a polished silver briefcase. He placed it on his lap and entered a combination code. The heavy metal latches clicked open. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a single encrypted titanium flash drive. He picked it up and held it out to me. "What is this?" I asked, taking the small drive. It felt heavy and substantial in my hand. "This is your entry ticket to Friday's dinner," Elias said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. That drive contains the complete, unredacted financial filings for Jamal Washington's hedge fund over the last 48 hours. Our analysts at Vanguard Trust flagged his accounts this morning. Jamal is attempting to use the 3 commercial buildings he inherited today as collateral to secure a massive line of credit from an offshore bank. He is falsifying the property valuations by entirely omitting the secondary mortgages your father took out. My forensic accountant instincts flared instantly. My mind automatically began structuring the financial audit. He is committing blatant loan fraud. If he uses assets that are already leveraged to Vanguard Trust to secure new capital without disclosing the prior debt, that is a severe federal crime. He is manipulating the equity to trick new investors. A very serious federal crime indeed. Elias agreed. He needs that fresh capital to launch a massive new real estate project to impress those Wall Street heavy hitters your mother mentioned. He thinks the commercial buildings are his golden goose. He has no idea Vanguard Trust already owns the golden goose, the nest, and the farm it sits on. I turned the flash drive over in my fingers. My sister Brittany had spent her entire life looking down on me, fully believing her marriage to Jamal made her untouchable royalty. My parents had treated me like a peasant because I demanded honesty and transparency in my work, instead of chasing superficial wealth. Now Jamal was about to step up to a microphone and publicly stake his professional reputation on assets that legally belonged to me. I need full access to Vanguard's forensic software, I told Elias, slipping the flash drive into my purse. If Jamal is bringing investors to this dinner, he is going to hand out a prospectus. I want to cross-reference his public claims against the actual debt numbers on this drive. When I walk into that party, I want to know exactly how many federal laws he is breaking per syllable. Elias smiled, pressing a button on the console to signal the driver. The Vanguard Command Center is at your absolute disposal, Chief Executive Officer. We have teams ready to trace every single dime Jamal tries to move. The town car banked sharply, heading toward the financial district where the Vanguard headquarters pierced the clouds. I looked down at my hands, remembering the shock on my parents' faces when I threw that $20 bill on the lawyer's table. That was just a small preview. They wanted me to attend their party to witness their triumph. They wanted me to sit in the corner and feel inadequate while Jamal played the billionaire genius. "Let them celebrate," Elias said quietly, his voice cutting through my thoughts with surgical precision. "Let them put on their designer clothes, drink their expensive wine, and boast to the world about their new empire. They are dancing on a trapdoor, Cassidy. And on Friday night, you are going to pull the lever." Friday night arrived precisely on schedule. I pulled my practical 5-year-old sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of Brittany and Jamal's Mercer Island mega mansion. I handed my keys to a valet who looked utterly bewildered, standing amidst a sea of Ferraris, Bentleys, and custom Maybachs. Walking up the sweeping marble steps, my forensic accounting brain automatically calculated the property taxes, the maintenance fees, and the heating costs. They were bleeding cash just to keep the lights on in the foyer. Inside, the interior looked like a spread from a billionaire lifestyle magazine. Waiters in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne, weaving through crowds of Wall Street heavy hitters and local socialites. I had barely checked my coat when my sister spotted me. Brittany glided across the polished marble floor in a custom silk gown. Around her neck rested a diamond necklace so massive it practically generated its own gravitational pull. "You actually showed up," Brittany said. Her voice carried just enough volume to ensure the wealthy couple standing nearby turned to look. "Mom said you were threatening to cause a scene because you are broke. I am surprised you did not wear your work uniform. Do accountants even have uniforms? Khakis and a calculator?" I smiled, my expression perfectly serene. "Good evening, Brittany. The house is beautiful. I am sure the bank is very proud of it." Her jaw tightened, but she quickly recovered, turning to her wealthy friends with a theatrical sigh. "Everyone, this is my little sister Cassidy. She is just a low-level number cruncher. Grandpa left her entirely out of the will because of her bad attitude. We try to include her out of pity, but she refuses to learn how to dress for these kinds of high society events." The friends offered me awkward, sympathetic smiles, clearly uncomfortable with the public shaming. I did not flinch. I did not look down. "Where would you like me to sit, Brittany?" I asked pleasantly. "I assume you did not put me at the head table with Jamal's elite investors." "Of course not," she sneered. She gestured toward the very back of the massive ballroom, far away from the stage and the string quartet. "We put you in the back. Try not to bother the important guests." I followed her pointed finger. My assigned seat was a tiny wobbly folding table, shoved directly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The waitstaff were actively using the edge of my table to stack dirty appetizer plates. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of where I stood in this family. I walked over and took my seat with absolute grace. A young waiter with a panicked expression immediately tried to move a stack of soiled dishes out of my way. "Leave them," I told him gently. "You are working hard tonight. I do not mind the company." He looked at me with immense gratitude before rushing back into the kitchen. From my vantage point in the shadows of the catering corner, I had a perfect view of the entire ballroom. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened the highly secure Vanguard Trust application. While my family paraded around the room, I watched the live financial data stream across my screen. Patricia and Richard were working the room aggressively, boasting about their new commercial highrises. I watched my father clap a wealthy investor on the back, pouring him a $200 glass of scotch, completely oblivious that the very floor he stood on was collateralized by the company I now controlled. Then the sharp chiming of a knife against a crystal flute silenced the room. Jamal Washington stood at the front of the ballroom on a small raised dais. He looked immaculate, projecting the exact image of an untouchable Wall Street titan. The crowd hushed, giving him their full attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate the Carmichael and Washington family legacy." Jamal boomed, his deep, charismatic voice commanding the room. "We are here to honor the passing of a great man, but more importantly, we are here to celebrate the future, a very lucrative future." He paused for dramatic effect, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile. "As many of you know, my beautiful wife and I recently inherited a massive commercial real estate portfolio in the downtown financial district. Prime assets, cash flowing perfectly. But in the hedge fund world, we do not just sit on cash, we make it multiply." I leaned forward in my chair. The Vanguard data on my phone screen glowed brightly in the dim light of the catering corner. I looked around at the faces of the investors in the crowd. I recognized several men from major corporate banks. "Tonight I am officially announcing the launch of the Washington Apex Fund," Jamal declared, raising his glass higher. "A $200 million development project that will reshape the city's skyline. And to show my absolute confidence in this venture, I am personally capitalizing the initial launch by putting up the entirety of our newly inherited downtown commercial buildings as collateral for the seed funding. We are going all in, ladies and gentlemen." The ballroom erupted into applause. Wealthy investors nodded in approval at his aggressive business strategy. My father beamed with pride. Brittany touched her diamond necklace, looking like absolute royalty. My eyes narrowed, tracking the numbers on my secure server. Jamal was standing in front of 50 millionaire investors, publicly declaring he was using those 3 commercial high-rises as clean, unencumbered collateral to secure new loans. He was deliberately hiding the secondary mortgages my father had taken out. He was intentionally omitting the massive debt Vanguard Trust already held on those exact same buildings. If a person uses heavily leveraged assets to secure fresh capital without disclosing the prior debt, it is not an aggressive business strategy. It is textbook wire fraud. Jamal was not just lying to his family. He had just committed a federal crime on a microphone in front of a room full of witnesses. The trapdoor was wide open, and he had just gleefully jumped right through it. The applause in the ballroom finally died down, replaced by the eager chatter of investors hungry for a piece of the action. I remained at my wobbly table by the kitchen doors, processing the sheer magnitude of the federal crime I had just witnessed. Jamal was not just a greedy opportunist. He was actively orchestrating a massive financial fraud on a microphone. I stood up and made my way toward the marble-topped bar at the far edge of the room. I needed a glass of sparkling water to wash down the absolute absurdity of the evening. Before the bartender could even acknowledge me, a heavy hand slammed onto the counter directly to my left. I turned my head. Jamal was standing there, radiating the toxic confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He was practically buzzing with adrenaline from his speech. "Enjoying the show from the cheap seats?" Cassidy Jamal asked. He leaned heavily against the polished marble, looking me up and down with an expression of overt disgust. His eyes lingered critically on my charcoal blazer and sensible shoes. "You really should have begged your sister for a loan to buy a decent outfit. That cheap off-the-rack suit is a complete eyesore in a room full of actual wealth. You stick out like a sore thumb." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. This was the same dynamic we had played out at every family dinner for the past 5 years. Jamal would insult my income, my clothes, and my career, while my parents nodded along in agreement. But tonight, the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. "I dress for practicality, Jamal," I replied smoothly. "Some of us actually work for our paychecks instead of stealing them." Jamal threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a calculated sound designed to draw the attention of a nearby group of banking executives. "Stealing, please. That is the tragic limited mentality of a low-level clerk. You simply do not understand leverage." He reached inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, glossy booklet bound in expensive, heavy cardstock. He dropped it onto the bar directly in front of me with a heavy thud. "This is how the financial elite operate, Cassidy. Take a look at the official Washington Apex Fund prospectus. Go ahead. Indulge yourself in some real financial intellect. It might be the closest you ever get to actual wealth." I picked up the heavy document. The cover was stamped with bold gold foil. Jamal thought he was handing me a prop to humiliate me. He forgot that I spent my entire adult life hunting down corporate criminals who were infinitely smarter than him. As a forensic accountant, my brain is hardwired to dismantle financial narratives. I flipped the booklet open, bypassing the flashy marketing photos and heading straight for the core financials at the back. My eyes scanned the dense spreadsheets with lethal precision. In less than 20 seconds, the structural fraud leapt off the page. The EBITDA numbers were wildly manipulated. Earnings before interest taxes. Depreciation and amortization is a standard metric for evaluating a company's operational profitability, but Jamal had weaponized it. He was claiming projected revenues based on absolutely zero historical data. He had inflated the asset value of the 3 commercial high-rises by at least 40% to make his equity look massive. More importantly, my eyes locked onto the liabilities column. It was completely blank. He had entirely erased the massive secondary mortgages my father had taken out over the last decade. He was presenting these buildings to his investors as free and clear properties. It was a textbook shell game designed to secure millions in fresh capital by hiding the devastating truth that Vanguard Trust already owned the debt on every single brick of those buildings. "Do not strain your brain trying to read big boy math," Jamal sneered, signaling the bartender for a bourbon. I know you are used to doing basic tax returns for local hardware stores, but this is high-level quantitative structuring. You need a background in venture capital to even comprehend the kind of leverage I am pulling here. I let out a soft, defeated sigh, playing perfectly into his assumption that I was a clueless, intimidated younger sister. It is certainly very complex, I said. I held the prospectus slightly lower, shielding it with my body from the rest of the room. My phone was already palmed securely in my left hand. I tapped the side button with my thumb, activating the camera lens. With 3 swift, silent clicks, I captured crystal-clear high-resolution images of the fraudulent balance sheets and the manipulated eBay-TDI projections. The evidence was secured and uploaded instantly to my encrypted Vanguard server. I snapped the glossy booklet shut and pushed it back across the marble counter. I turned to face him fully, letting the mask of the intimidated sister drop completely to the floor. My posture straightened. My eyes locked onto his cold, analytical, and completely unyielding. You are right, Jamal. It is a fascinating strategy, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, deadly whisper that cut right through the noise of the ballroom. Claiming unencumbered equity on commercial assets that are already leveraged to the absolute limit. Presenting fabricated earnings reports to secure massive wire transfers from federally insured banking institutions. Jamal's smug smile froze instantly. The glass of bourbon stopped halfway to his mouth. He blinked hard, clearly struggling to comprehend how the family scapegoat, the boring salary worker, had just perfectly summarized his illegal financial maneuvering in 2 precise sentences. The arrogance drained from his features, leaving only the raw, wide-eyed look of a man who realized he had just handed a loaded gun to his worst enemy. I stepped closer, leaning in so only he could hear my final words over the sound of the string quartet. Good luck with the SEC audits. I turned on my heel and walked away toward the exit, leaving him standing absolutely paralyzed at the bar. I had barely taken 10 steps away from the marble bar when a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was my father, Richard. His grip was punishingly tight, his knuckles turning white against the fabric of my cheap charcoal blazer. Beside him stood my mother, Patricia. Her eyes darted nervously around the glittering ballroom to ensure none of Jamal's wealthy investors were watching us. Before I could utter a single word, they practically dragged me down a dimly lit, velvet-lined hallway and shoved me into the mansion's massive executive study. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind us, and I heard the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt engaging. I smoothed my jacket, keeping my breathing perfectly even and my expression carefully blank. The study smelled of expensive leather, imported cigars, and absolute desperation. The walls were lined with custom bookshelves filled with pristine, unread hardcovers, a perfect metaphor for my parents' entirely fabricated intellectual depth. My father marched over to the massive mahogany desk, picked up a thick legal document, and slapped it down right in front of me. He tapped the paper with a manicured finger, his face twisted in an ugly scowl. It is time for you to finally contribute to this family, Cassidy, he demanded. I stepped closer and glanced down at the document. It was a property transfer agreement. They were demanding I sign over the deed to my 2-bedroom apartment. It was a modest, quiet place my grandfather had bought for me straight out of college, so I could focus on passing my grueling forensic accounting exams without constantly worrying about making rent. It was the only place I truly felt safe, and now my parents were trying to steal it. Patricia crossed her arms, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking sharply in the quiet room. Jamal is launching a massive fund tonight, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. He needs to show total liquidity to his investors. He is facing aggressive margin calls by the end of the week, and he needs clean collateral immediately. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the sheer audacity of her statement. My forensic accounting brain immediately connected the dots. Jamal could not use the newly inherited commercial buildings for liquidity because they were secretly leveraged to the absolute maximum. The banks were already breathing down his neck. He was so incredibly desperate for unencumbered assets that he was forcing my parents to extort my tiny apartment just to keep his fraudulent hedge fund afloat for a few more days. You want me to sign over my home so your son-in-law can use it to cover his highly illegal financial gambling, I stated, keeping my tone completely flat. My father leaned across the desk, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. You do not understand the stakes here, Cassidy. Jamal is about to make us richer than your grandfather ever dreamed. He is playing in the big leagues now. We are not asking you for the deed. We are telling you. And if I refuse? I asked. Patricia smiled. It was a cold, venomous expression that lacked any trace of maternal warmth. If you refuse, your father will have our estate lawyers file a lawsuit against you first thing Monday morning. We will sue you for elder abuse. The sheer absurdity of the threat almost made me laugh out loud. My grandfather was the sharpest mind I had ever known, right up until his final days. The idea that I could manipulate him was ridiculous. Richard nodded aggressively, slamming his fist on the desk to emphasize his point. You manipulated a sick elderly man into buying you real estate while his mental faculties were declining. You coerced him into funding your lifestyle while you contributed nothing to his actual businesses. We have the best, most ruthless attorneys in Seattle on retainer. They will drag you through civil court for years. We will freeze your bank accounts. We will drag your name through the mud in every financial circle in this city. He stepped around the desk, invading my personal space. You are a forensic accountant, Cassidy. Your entire professional reputation is built on integrity. What do you think a highly publicized, brutal lawsuit for financial elder abuse will do to your precious career? You will be fired instantly. You will lose your license. You will be blacklisted and living on the streets before the trial even begins. They were entirely serious. They truly believed they held all the leverage. They were willing to destroy my career, steal my home, and falsely accuse me of abusing the only man in this family who ever actually loved me, all to feed Jamal's collapsing financial house of cards. They felt so powerful, so untouchable in their designer clothes and their locked executive study. Sign the paper, Cassidy, my father ordered. He pushed a heavy gold fountain pen across the desk. It rolled to a stop right against my knuckles. Sign it and we will let you walk out of here with your boring little job intact. You can go rent a cheap studio somewhere else. Consider it your final payment for all the years we tolerated your disrespect and your lack of ambition. My mother stepped closer, her expensive perfume suffocating in the locked room. Just sign it and stop fighting us. For once in your miserable life, do something useful for the people who gave you everything. Prove that you actually care about this family's legacy. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea that the encrypted Vanguard Trust titanium card was sitting securely in my purse. They did not know that their entire empire, including the very mansion we were currently standing in, was already leveraged to the shadow company I now legally controlled. They thought I was a terrified, powerless daughter backed into a corner, trembling at the thought of their expensive lawyers. They did not realize that I could bankrupt their attorneys, their businesses, and their entire lives with a single phone call to Elias. I looked down at the contract again. The printed text blurred slightly as I processed the breathtaking depth of their greed and delusion. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the signature line on the fraudulent property transfer. A profound icy calm washed over my entire body. I reached out and wrapped my fingers slowly around the cold metal barrel of the pen. I lifted it, feeling its heavy weight in my hand. I slowly lowered the pen, hovering the gold nib just a millimeter above the dotted signature line. My father exhaled a sharp, heavy breath of relief. My mother crossed her arms, a triumphant, greedy smile spreading across her face as she waited eagerly for me to surrender everything I had left. The heavy gold nib touched the thick paper of the contract. My father exhaled a sharp breath of relief. My mother crossed her arms with a triumphant, greedy smile spreading across her face. They were already visualizing the liquidity my home would bring them, already mentally spending the equity to prop up Jamal's crumbling hedge fund. Instead of signing my name, I pressed the gold nib down hard against the document. I dragged it diagonally from the top right corner all the way down to the bottom left. I lifted the pen, moved it to the top left corner, and slashed a second thick line straight down to the bottom right. The ink bled deeply into the expensive paper, creating a massive, undeniable X across the entire signature page. I pressed with so much force that the sharp metal tip actually tore right through the contract, leaving a jagged rip in the center of the paper. I dropped the gold pen. It clattered loudly against the mahogany desk. My father stared at the ruined document, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. The smug satisfaction completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a dark, volatile rage. "What in the world are you doing?" he shouted, slamming both hands down on the desk. "Have you completely lost your mind?" I stepped back, my posture perfectly straight, and looked him dead in the eye. "You really should have consulted a competent attorney before attempting to extort a forensic accountant. Let us discuss property law, Richard." My mother gasped at my use of his first name, but I did not stop. "You want to sue me for elder abuse and coercion regarding a property transfer that occurred 5 years ago. First, the statute of limitations for challenging that specific deed transfer in this state has already expired. Second, to prove undue influence or a lack of testamentary capacity in a civil court, you need concrete medical evidence that Grandpa was mentally compromised. He was not. In fact, he submitted to comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluations every 6 months to legally maintain his corporate board seats. I happen to possess certified copies of those medical records. They prove his mental acuity was in the top percentile right up until the week he died." My father opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer velocity of my legal dismantling left him speechless. Furthermore, I continued, my voice echoing like ice cracking in a quiet room. "If you attempt to file that lawsuit, I will immediately file a countersuit for malicious prosecution. I will seek severe financial sanctions against your lawyers for filing frivolous litigation. But that is not the worst part for you. During the discovery phase of my countersuit, I will legally demand a full, unredacted audit of your current financial records to prove to the judge that you filed a baseless lawsuit purely out of extreme financial desperation." The color completely drained from my father's face. He suddenly looked hollowed out and terrified. "The moment a judge forces you to open your books," I stated, stepping closer to him, "the court will see the massive secondary mortgages you have been hiding. They will see that Jamal is severely overleveraged. You will not just lose the case. You will expose your entire fraudulent financial network to the public record. Your country club friends, your banking partners, and the federal regulators will see exactly how broke you truly are. So please go ahead and call your ruthless lawyers. I dare you." The study fell dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, panicked breathing of my parents. They had brought me into this room to intimidate me, fully believing I was still the quiet, obedient scapegoat they could bully into submission. They had completely underestimated the woman standing in front of them. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia shrieked, the sound tearing through the quiet study. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward, her hands curled into fists, but my father threw his arm out to hold her back. "We gave you everything," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "We tolerated your absolute mediocrity for decades. We let you exist in our shadow, and this is how you repay us. You are a pathetic, boring little girl who will never amount to anything. You deserve to be destitute. You deserve to live on the streets. You are dead to this family." I looked at my mother. I saw no maternal instinct, no love, no grace. I saw only a desperate, greedy woman terrified of losing her social status. "I was dead to this family the moment I decided to think for myself," I replied calmly. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak door. I reached out, twisted the brass deadbolt, and pulled the door open. The muffled sounds of the extravagant party outside flooded back into the study. The clinking glasses, the string quartet, the false laughter of people pretending to be richer than they were. "Enjoy the celebration," I said without looking back. I walked out of the study and navigated my way straight through the glittering ballroom. I walked past the wealthy investors, past the waiters carrying champagne, and past my sister Brittany, who was too busy showing off her diamond necklace to notice my departure. I walked right out the front doors of the mega mansion and descended the sweeping marble steps into the cool, crisp night air. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my sensible sedan. As I waited on the pristine driveway, I pulled my cell phone from my purse. The screen illuminated the darkness. I opened my contacts and pressed the button to call my grandfather's wealth manager. Elias answered on the first ring. The Vanguard Command Center is standing by Chief Executive Officer. How was the party? Highly informative, I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the illuminated windows of the mansion where my family was currently dancing on their trapdoor. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute, undeniable power of my grandfather's hidden empire coursing through my veins. The time for observation was over. It was time to strike. Freeze their credit lines. I ordered, my voice steady and commanding in the quiet night. All of them. Lock down Richard's accounts, freeze Patricia's credit cards, and completely sever Jamal's banking access. Execute the margin calls tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. Let them wake up to a burning house. Consider it done, Elias said, a dark satisfaction echoing in his tone. The Vanguard Trust will collect its debts. I ended the call just as the valet pulled my car up to the curb. I slipped into the driver's seat, put the car in gear, and drove away from the mansion. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I had an empire to run, and tomorrow my family was going to learn the true cost of their greed. The following Monday morning arrived with crisp, unsympathetic sunlight pouring over the Seattle skyline. I sat at the executive desk in the Vanguard Trust Command Center, an untouched espresso steaming to my right. Elias stood by the wall of monitors, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the financial feeds with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. At exactly 8:01 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Across town, Brittany was maintaining her usual Monday routine. She was standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive luxury boutique in Bellevue, preparing to purchase a $15,000 designer handbag to reward herself for simply surviving the weekend. She handed the sales associate her heavy metal black card with a practiced dismissive flick of her wrist. The associate swiped the card. A sharp negative beep sounded. The associate frowned, tapped the screen, and tried again. Another rejection. I am terribly sorry, Mrs. Washington, the associate said, her tone dropping into that specific register of forced polite panic reserved for wealthy clients whose money suddenly stops working. Your card has been declined. Brittany stared at the woman as if she had just spoken a foreign language. Declined. That is impossible. Run it again. That account has no limit. The associate ran it a third time. The screen flashed a hard red warning. The bank has placed a total freeze on the account, ma'am. You will need to contact your financial institution immediately. Brittany snatched this card back, her face flushing with a mixture of profound embarrassment and mounting rage. She pulled out her phone and furiously dialed Jamal's number. It went straight to voicemail. 10 miles away in the glass-walled corner office of his hedge fund firm, Jamal was currently incapable of answering his wife's call because he was too busy screaming at his primary wealth manager over speakerphone. What do you mean you cannot authorize the transfers? Jamal roared, slamming his fist down on his expansive desk. The ink on the seed funding is dry. I have 50 investors expecting those funds to clear this morning. Mr. Washington, the banker replied, his voice trembling under the pressure. I am looking at the screen right now. We cannot process any outgoing wire transfers or access your margin accounts. An external entity has executed an emergency freeze on all of your personal and corporate assets. Jamal froze, the aggressive posturing suddenly faltering. What external entity? Who has the authority to freeze my accounts? The Vanguard Trust. The banker read the notification aloud. They initiated a breach of contract protocol at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. They are citing heavily over-leveraged debt and failure to disclose secondary mortgages on your commercial real estate collateral. They are exercising their right as the primary creditor to seize control of all linked assets. Jamal sank into his custom leather office chair, the blood completely draining from his face. The Vanguard Trust. The name echoed in his mind, connecting the dots of his own arrogant financial maneuvers. He had tried to play a massive shell game entirely unaware that Vanguard was the entity holding the shell. He was locked out. His hedge fund accounts, his personal checking, the equity lines on the new mansion, all of it was gone. He had zero liquidity and 50 angry investors about to realize he had lied to them on a microphone. My desk phone buzzed in the Vanguard Command Center. Elias tapped a button routing the call through the room's speakers. It was an automated update from the banking sector. Asset freeze successful, the computerized voice confirmed. All accounts linked to Richard Carmichael, Patricia Carmichael, Brittany Washington, and Jamal Washington have been locked pending foreclosure review. Excellent. Elias murmured, a tight smile forming on his lips. The dominoes are falling precisely on schedule. I leaned back in my chair watching the real-time data confirm the collapse of their financial house of cards. They had built their entire identities on the illusion of limitless wealth. Now stripped of their access to capital, they were about to discover who they really were. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Jamal did not try to fix the situation calmly. He did not call his lawyers to strategize. Instead, fueled by panic and a desperate need to avoid federal prison, he went straight into survival mode. He stormed out of his office, ignored his frantic secretary, and drove his leased sports car straight to my parents' country club estate. Richard was sitting on his patio nursing a morning scotch and complaining to Patricia about the unseasonable chill in the air when Jamal burst through the French doors like a hurricane. "You set me up!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard's chest. "You handed me dirty assets." Richard stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his drink. "What are you talking about?" Jamal, lower. "Your voice, the neighbors will hear you." "I do not care about the neighbors," Jamal shouted, pacing furiously across the expensive patio stones. "I tried to leverage the commercial buildings this morning to secure my fund launch. The bank froze everything. They told me Vanguard Trust executed a breach of contract because the buildings are secretly mortgaged to the hilt. You knew. The equity was garbage, and you let me use it as collateral." Patricia dropped her coffee cup. It shattered against the stone, splashing dark liquid everywhere. "Richard," she gasped, turning to her husband. "Tell me that is not true. Tell me you did not leverage the buildings." Richard's face contorted into a mask of defensive panic. He backed away from Jamal. "It was temporary. I needed capital to cover the margin calls on my private investments a few years ago. I was going to pay it back before your grandfather died. I did not know Vanguard was going to call the debt immediately." Jamal grabbed the collar of Richard's expensive golf shirt. "Because of your secret loans, Vanguard just locked down my entire firm. I have federal auditors scheduled to review my prospectus next week. When they see I tried to secure funding with encumbered assets, I am going to federal prison for wire fraud, and I am taking you down with me." Brittany burst onto the patio, having just arrived from her humiliating experience at the boutique. She heard the end of Jamal's screaming match. She looked at her husband, then at her father, the perfect illusion of their wealthy family shattering right before her eyes. "You are going to prison," Brittany shrieked, clutching her face in horror. "Jamal, what did you do?" Jamal spun around to face his wife, completely abandoning any pretense of marital loyalty. "Your father handed me toxic real estate to cover his own massive debts. Your entire family is a financial fraud. You are completely broke, Brittany. We have nothing." The patio erupted into absolute chaos. The golden child, the perfect son-in-law, and the affluent parents began tearing each other apart. Patricia screamed at Richard for lying to her. Brittany sobbed hysterically, realizing her luxury lifestyle was officially dead. Jamal threatened to testify against Richard to save his own skin. They were no longer a united front of wealth and superiority. They were rats trapped in a sinking ship, violently attacking each other for the last piece of driftwood. I sat quietly in my office at Vanguard, watching the financial alerts continue to roll in. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I did not fit into their superficial world. Now they were destroying each other over the very money they used to control me. The empire was burning, and I had not even lit the match. I had simply forced them to look at the fire they started themselves. The brutal reality of total financial ruin rarely hits a narcissist all at once. Usually, they believe their charm or their connections can buy them a way out. My father was the perfect example of this delusion. Less than an hour after the explosive confrontation on his patio, Richard Carmichael decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove his leased Porsche directly to the downtown branch of his primary wealth management bank, fully expecting to bully his way out of the crisis. He marched through the polished glass doors, completely ignoring the reception desk, and headed straight for the branch manager's corner office. For a decade, this bank had treated my father like royalty, offering him premium cigars and private golf outings simply for keeping his heavily leveraged accounts with them. He expected the same treatment today. "I demand you lift the freeze on my accounts immediately," my father barked, slamming his hands down on the manager's desk. "This is a massive clerical error. I have a platinum status with this institution, and I will not be treated like a common debtor." The branch manager did not offer him a cigar. He did not even stand up. He looked at my father with the cold, detached pity usually reserved for people who had just lost everything. "Richard, for I strongly advise you to lower your voice," the manager said calmly, sliding a thick stack of legal notices across the desk. "This is not a clerical error. Vanguard Trust executed a hostile takeover of your debt portfolio early this morning. They presented irrefutable proof that you violated the covenant of your loans by engaging in undisclosed secondary borrowing." "I do not care about Vanguard Trust," my father yelled, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "I am Richard Carmichael. You know my net worth. You know my portfolio. Override the block right now, or I am moving my entire estate to a competing bank." "You do not have an estate to move," the manager replied, his tone dropping the final hammer. "Vanguard Trust holds the master lien on your commercial high-rises, your residential property, and your liquid capital. We are legally bound to surrender your accounts to them. You have a zero balance with us, Richard. In fact, you are currently trespassing." My father tried to lean over the desk, shouting threats about lawsuits and ruined careers. The manager simply picked up his phone and pressed a single button. Less than 30 seconds later, 2 large security guards entered the office. They grabbed my father by the arms of his custom-tailored golf shirt and physically dragged him backward. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed as they hauled him across the marble floor of the bank lobby. Wealthy clients and local business owners turned to watch the spectacle. The man who had spent his entire life obsessed with projecting an image of untouchable upper-class dignity was now being forcefully thrown out the front doors like a common vagrant. Back in the secure command center at Vanguard headquarters, I watched the security footage of his eviction on a secondary monitor. Elias had arranged for the bank to share the feed with us. It was clinical and efficient. I felt absolutely nothing. My personal cell phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name again. She had called 14 times in the last hour. I had ignored every single one, letting her stew in the panic of her collapsing reality. But this time I decided to answer. I tapped the screen and put the phone on speaker. "Cassidy, thank God!" Patricia gasped the second the line connected. Her voice was frantic, stripped entirely of its usual arrogant drawl. She was practically hyperventilating. "You have to help us. Everything is falling apart. Jamal and your father are threatening to kill each other, and the credit cards are all declining." "Take a deep breath, Mother," I said, leaning back in the plush executive chair. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Patricia lowered her voice to a desperate, conspiring whisper, likely hiding in a bathroom to make the call. "You are a forensic accountant. You know how to manipulate ledgers and bypass corporate firewalls. I need you to hack into this Vanguard Trust company. Find a legal loophole. Erase the secondary mortgages from their database or freeze their collection process. You know how to do this kind of computer stuff." I stared at the phone, genuinely amazed by the sheer scale of her audacity. She had spent my entire adult life telling her country club friends that my career was a boring, low-level embarrassment. Now that her designer lifestyle was evaporating, she suddenly wanted to weaponize my expertise to save her skin. Even worse, she was openly demanding I commit major federal crimes to cover up the massive financial fraud my father and Jamal had orchestrated. "Mother," I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, "you are asking me to commit severe cybercrimes and financial fraud to rescue men who have spent a decade lying to the government." "We are your family!" she shrieked, panic breaking through her hushed tone. "You owe us. You have to fix this before we lose the mansion. If you do not wipe out these Vanguard files, we are going to be ruined. Just use your accounting skills and make it go away." I picked up the heavy titanium Vanguard access card from my desk and traced its raised lettering with my thumb. I do not commit felonies for people who seat me with the catering staff, I said evenly. Good luck with the foreclosure. I hit the end call button and blocked her number permanently. I looked up at Elias, who was standing near the digital display board with a look of deep satisfaction. He nodded approvingly, recognizing that I had completely severed the final emotional chain tying me to their toxic world. But the financial bleeding was far from over. Across the city, the pressure cooker was finally cracking the weakest link in their chain. Jamal Washington was pacing the floor of his corner office. The sun had gone down, leaving him illuminated only by the harsh glow of his computer monitors. He was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, his tie discarded somewhere on the floor. His phone had been ringing nonstop for hours. Wealthy investors were demanding answers about the Vanguard freeze. The Securities and Exchange Commission had sent a formal inquiry notice. Margin calls were scheduled to hit his accounts at the opening bell tomorrow. He needed cash. He needed exactly $10 million by dawn to cover the immediate shortfall, appease the most aggressive investors, and buy himself enough time to flee the country or forge a completely new set of books. But his personal accounts were locked. His corporate credit was dead. He had absolutely zero legal avenues left to acquire that kind of capital. Jamal stopped pacing and stared at his dual monitor setup. On the right screen was the portal for his client trust accounts. It was a holding vault containing millions of dollars belonging to the investors he managed. It was highly regulated, heavily monitored, and legally untouchable money meant purely for secure asset storage. Desperation breeds severe stupidity. Jamal convinced himself he was a genius who could outsmart the system. He told himself it was just a temporary bridge loan. If he could just move the money to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, he could clear his immediate debt, secure new funding, and put the money back before the auditors noticed it was missing. He sat down at his keyboard, his hands trembling slightly as he logged into the restricted portal. He initiated a wire transfer request, manually typing in the authorization codes to move $10 million of stolen client funds into his personal offshore account. He bypassed 3 separate compliance warnings, overriding the security protocols with his executive credentials. He hovered his finger over the final execute button. He thought he was saving his life. He had no idea he was stepping directly into the crosshairs of a forensic accountant who was watching his every single keystroke. Jamal pressed enter. The massive digital display board in the Vanguard Trust Command Center flashed a sudden brilliant crimson. A high-pitched proximity alarm chirped twice before I silenced it with a single keystroke. I leaned forward in my leather chair and stared at the cascading lines of data pouring across my primary monitor. Jamal had done it. He had actually done it. We had him, I said, my voice entirely devoid of surprise but thick with satisfaction. He just initiated the wire transfer. $10 million is moving out of his client trust portal right now. Elias walked over to stand behind my chair. He crossed his arms and watched the screen as the offshore routing numbers populated in real time. He is sending it to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a classic amateur move. He intends to bounce it through a Caribbean tax haven before routing it back to his domestic margin accounts to cover the shortfall. Shall I trigger the hard block and bounce the funds back to the holding vault? I did not touch the keyboard. I just watched the progress bar on the screen inch forward. 10%. 20%. No, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the data stream. If we block the transfer now, he only gets flagged for an attempted breach of fiduciary duty. He could claim his computer was hacked or that a subordinate made a catastrophic clerical error. He would hire expensive defense attorneys to muddy the waters, and he might just walk away with a massive fine and a suspended trading license. I am not going to let him walk away, Elias. I want him buried. Elias let out a low, appreciative hum. So we let the transaction complete. Exactly, I said. For a financial crime to carry the maximum federal sentencing guidelines, the transaction must be fully executed. The moment that $10 million hits international waters, it officially becomes felony wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. He is stealing directly from the retirement accounts and college funds of his own investors. We are going to let him hang himself with his own rope. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. As a forensic accountant, I had spent years dissecting the digital aftermath of corporate theft, but tracking it live was a completely different thrill. I did not disrupt his transfer pathway. Instead, I built a shadow tunnel right alongside it. Using Vanguard's proprietary security software, I mirrored every single data packet Jamal was transmitting. I captured his unique IP address and the exact MAC address of the desktop computer sitting in his corner office. I logged the specific executive override codes he typed in to bypass his firm's internal compliance warnings. I recorded the precise second he clicked the authorization button. I packaged every single piece of metadata into an encrypted digital vault. I was not just watching him steal. I was building a pristine, undeniable chain of evidence that defense attorneys could never dismantle. When the progress bar on his transfer hit 100%, the funds vanished from the domestic accounts. Transfer complete, Elias noted, his voice quiet in the dim room. He just bought himself a 10-year mandatory minimum in a federal penitentiary. I locked the encrypted file and routed it directly to a secure, compartmentalized server I had set up specifically for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had an old contact in the white-collar crime division who was going to have a very exciting morning when she opened her inbox tomorrow. Jamal thought he had just saved his hedge fund. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed the federal government the exact weapon they needed to destroy him. The financial trap was fully armed and triggered. The margin calls would hit my father and Jamal at the opening bell. Their credit lines were dead. Their liquid cash was gone. They had nowhere left to run. I stood up from the terminal and grabbed my coat. I will be at my apartment, Elias. Keep the lockdown protocols active across all their accounts. Do not authorize a single penny to move without my direct verbal permission. Elias gave a sharp, respectful nod. Have a good evening, Chief Executive Officer. I left the soaring glass and steel architecture of the Vanguard headquarters and drove my practical sedan back to my neighborhood. I still lived in the modest, quiet apartment my grandfather had bought for me years ago. It was not a sprawling mega mansion, but it was paid for, and it was mine. The drive cleared my head. I felt an incredible sense of absolute peace. The anxiety that had plagued me for my entire adult life, the constant feeling of inadequacy forced upon me by my parents, was entirely gone. I had surgically removed the toxic infection from my life, and I had done it using the exact skills they had always mocked. I parked my car in the underground garage and took the elevator up to my floor. As the metal doors slid open, I heard a sound that made my perfectly calm heart rate instantly spike. It was the sound of someone violently pounding on a heavy wooden door. I stepped out of the elevator and turned the corner down my hallway. Standing directly in front of my apartment door was my sister Brittany. I stopped in my tracks, entirely shocked by the sight of her. The golden child of the Carmichael family was completely unrecognizable. The pristine, perfect image she had projected at her party just 48 hours ago had been thoroughly destroyed. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Her designer hair was a tangled, messy knot. Her makeup was severely smudged around her eyes, leaving dark raccoon circles trailing down her cheeks. She slammed her fists against my door again, screaming at the top of her lungs. Cassidy, open the door right now. I know you are in there. You have to open the door. I walked slowly down the carpeted hallway, my keys jingling softly in my hand. Brittany spun around at the sound. Her eyes were wild and bloodshot. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse into dust. What are you doing here, Brittany? I asked, my tone completely flat and unaffected by her hysterics. She rushed toward me, grabbing the sleeves of my coat with trembling hands. You have to fix this, Cassidy. You have to use your accounting skills and fix this right now. Jamal's bank accounts are totally frozen. The credit cards will not work. We just got a notice from the bank that they are accelerating the foreclosure on the mansion. They are going to take the house, Cassidy. They are going to throw us out on the street. I looked down at her manicured hands clutching the fabric of my coat. Her knuckles were white with panic. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer her a comforting embrace. I calmly reached down, peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one, and stepped around her to unlock my apartment door. I pushed the door open and stepped inside my quiet, modest living room. Brittany followed me right over the threshold, completely uninvited, bringing the frantic, chaotic energy of her collapsing life into my sanctuary. She began pacing across my rug, her expensive heels sinking into the carpet as she rambled at a manic speed. "You have to take out a loan." "Cassidy," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding, as if she were ordering a servant rather than begging her estranged sister. "You have a pristine credit score. You have zero debt. You have been hoarding your salary in this tiny, pathetic apartment for years. Jamal needs a massive infusion of cash to satisfy his creditors before the market opens tomorrow. You need to go to your bank right now and take out a personal loan for $2 million. Maybe 3. You can leverage your accounting firm connections. Just get the money and wire it to Jamal." I turned around and stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from her was almost fascinating to witness. She was standing in my apartment, insulting my living space and simultaneously demanding I take out millions of dollars in high-interest debt to save her husband from federal prison. "You want me to completely destroy my financial future, to bail out a man who actively mocked my career 48 hours ago?" I stated, my voice dangerously calm. Brittany threw her hands up in the air, exasperated that I was not immediately complying with her orders. "Do not be so dramatic. Jamal will pay you back as soon as his new development fund clears. We are talking about saving our family legacy here. We are blood, Cassidy. We are sisters. You owe me this. You owe this family your loyalty." "I owe you my loyalty," I repeated. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked over to my kitchen island, placed my keys on the counter, and turned to face the sister who had spent my entire existence making me feel like a worthless outsider. "Let us talk about sisterly loyalty, Brittany," I said, keeping my gaze locked on her panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Let us talk about the night before my final forensic auditing certification exam. I was 24 years old. I had been studying for 6 months straight while working 2 jobs to afford the testing fees. Do you remember what you did that night?" Brittany crossed her arms defensively, looking away. "That has absolutely nothing to do with this. I was young. We were just having fun. You came back to our parents' house at 2 in the morning, completely intoxicated. After a country club party," I continued, my voice growing colder with every syllable. "You walked into the kitchen where I was studying. You looked at my notes, called me a boring, pathetic nerd, and then you deliberately knocked a full glass of red wine entirely over my laptop. You destroyed the motherboard. You destroyed months of my work and my study materials just hours before the most important exam of my life." "It was an accident," she shrieked, stepping back toward the door. "It was not an accident," I corrected her sharply. "Because when I dropped to the floor sobbing, trying desperately to save the hard drive, you stood over me and laughed. You laughed in my face. You told me that if I was not so ugly, I could just marry a rich man like you were planning to do, instead of pretending I was smart enough to be a professional. You told me my career was a joke. And when Mom and Dad woke up, they blamed me for leaving my computer on the kitchen table. They bought you a new diamond tennis bracelet the very next week to apologize for my crying ruining your night." Brittany opened her mouth, her face flushed with a mixture of guilt and defensive rage, but she had absolutely no argument. The truth was an impenetrable wall. "You did not care about my survival then," I stated, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches from her face. "You did not care about my financial future when you and your husband laughed at my envelope at the lawyer's office. You only care about blood and loyalty now because your bank accounts are locked, and you are absolutely terrified of losing your country club membership." "We are going to lose the mansion, Cassidy," she sobbed, abandoning the commanding tone and finally resorting to pathetic, genuine begging. The tears ruined the last of her expensive mascara. "I do not know how to live without that money. I do not know how to be poor. You have to help me." I looked at the woman who had tormented me for 3 decades. I felt no pity. I felt no sisterly affection. I felt only the swift clinical execution of justice. "You want money," I said quietly, opening my front door and gesturing toward the hallway. "Go get a job at a coffee shop." Brittany gasped, as if I had just physically struck her. "You are a monster," She hissed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of hatred. You are going to let your own sister be thrown out on the street. You are dead to me. You cannot kill a ghost, Brittany. I have been dead to you for years. Now get out of my apartment before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. She stared at me, realizing for the very first time that she had absolutely no power over me. The golden child was powerless. She turned and stumbled out into the hallway, sobbing hysterically as she ran toward the elevator. I gripped the edge of my heavy wooden door and slammed it shut behind her. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I stood in my quiet apartment, taking a deep breath of the calm, peaceful air. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a secure line. I answered it immediately. Chief Executive Officer, the sharp professional voice of Elias Thorne echoed through the speaker. Report, Elias, I commanded. The legal grace period on their delinquent loans has officially expired, he stated, a grim satisfaction lacing his tone. The banks have reported full default on all of Richard's secondary mortgages. Jamal's hedge fund accounts remain permanently locked due to suspected federal wire fraud. Their entire financial network is dead. Excellent, I replied, walking over to the large window overlooking the Seattle skyline. What is our next move? It is time, Elias said. I have authorized the dispatch of the couriers. It is time to summon your family to the Vanguard Trust headquarters for their official foreclosure hearing. I sat in the penthouse office of Vanguard Trust alongside Elias, watching a grid of live security feeds and GPS trackers on the wall-sized monitor. We had planted microscopic tracking chips inside the heavy black envelopes our couriers were currently delivering. I watched two flashing dots converge on the sprawling Carmichael estate and Jamal's mega mansion. It was Tuesday morning, and the weather outside was a miserable pouring rain that perfectly matched the atmosphere of impending doom surrounding my family. At exactly 9 o'clock, the couriers knocked on their respective doors simultaneously. The delivery was coordinated to the exact second. The envelopes were imposing, crafted from thick matte black parchment and sealed with the silver crest of Vanguard Trust. Inside those envelopes was a single page of heavy cardstock outlining a mandatory foreclosure and asset liquidation hearing scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon at our corporate headquarters. The letter stated clearly that failure to appear would result in the immediate forfeiture of all properties and the automatic referral of federal wire fraud charges to the authorities. Thanks to the sophisticated audio surveillance systems Elias had quietly integrated into the Vanguard security matrix during his years managing my grandfather's shadow empire, we were able to monitor their phone calls as the panic set in. Within minutes of receiving the summons, Jamal and Brittany sped over to my parents' house. I listened to the raw audio feed echoing through my office speakers. The initial reaction was pure, unfiltered chaos. Brittany was sobbing hysterically, screaming that she could not go to a foreclosure hearing and face public humiliation. Patricia was weeping about losing her social standing, while my father paced the floor, cursing the banks and blaming everyone but himself. But then the audio feed captured Jamal taking control of the room. His massive ego simply could not accept total defeat. I listened as he slammed his hand against a table, demanding their silence. He began to spin a frantic, delusional narrative to pacify his terrified in-laws. He told them that Vanguard Trust was nothing more than a faceless corporate machine run by weak middle management bureaucrats. He insisted that men like him, elite Wall Street titans, did not get destroyed by low-level paper pushers. He promised them that this hearing was just a standard intimidation tactic used by aggressive lenders. "We are not walking in there like victims," Jamal barked through the audio feed, his voice dripping with his usual toxic arrogance. "We are walking in there like royalty. These corporate drones are used to dealing with desperate people. I know how to handle these suits. I will charm the executives, I will intimidate their compliance officers, and I will restructure this debt by the end of the day. We just need to project absolute, undeniable wealth. They need to believe we are untouchable." I shook my head, marveling at the sheer scale of his delusion. He had just committed federal wire fraud. His assets were completely frozen, he had zero leverage, and he still believed a sharp suit and a confident smile could rewrite reality. They latched onto his delusional plan like a drowning crew clinging to a life raft. My parents and my sister desperately wanted to believe they were still the elite. They agreed to his strategy of psychological warfare. If they were going down, they refused to look like victims. They spent the next 3 hours putting on their armor. I knew exactly what that process looked like. Brittany would be sitting in front of her vanity mirror, aggressively fixing her ruined makeup, squeezing into her most expensive designer dress, and clasping heavy diamond jewelry around her wrists to hide the fact that her bank accounts were completely dead. Patricia would select her sharpest blazer and paint her lips a defiant shade of crimson. Richard would put on his custom Italian suit, polishing his luxury watch to project an aura of established generational wealth. Jamal would straighten his silk tie, practicing his most intimidating glare in the mirror. They were completely bankrupt, drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt and facing federal prison, yet they dressed up as if they were about to buy the entire city. It was a pathetic, magnificent display of ultimate denial. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the live security feed on my monitor shifted to the ground floor of the Vanguard Trust skyscraper. The towering glass and steel building was the most intimidating structure in the financial district. A black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. The doors opened and the four of them stepped out. They walked through the revolving glass doors with their heads held high. They marched across the polished marble lobby floor in a tight, unified formation. They looked down their noses at the security guards and offered the reception staff expressions of pure condescension, projecting the exact brand of toxic superiority they had weaponized against me for my entire life. They approached the private executive elevator bank reserved strictly for the Vanguard board. Jamal swiped the temporary access card provided in his black envelope. The heavy metal doors slid open with a soft chime. The four of them stepped inside the mirrored cabin. Richard adjusted his expensive cufflinks. Patricia lifted her chin, staring coldly ahead. Brittany checked her reflection in the mirrored walls, ensuring her diamonds caught the light. Jamal cracked his knuckles and pressed the glowing button for the penthouse boardroom. The elevator engaged, rocketing them upward at an incredible speed toward the top of the skyscraper. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pooling their collective arrogance, fully preparing to face down a room full of anonymous corporate executives. They had absolutely no idea they were riding straight up into the waiting jaws of the sister they had so cruelly discarded. The elevator chimed softly, announcing their arrival at the top floor. The heavy metal doors slid open and my family stepped out into the penthouse reception area of the Vanguard Trust headquarters. I sat perfectly still inside the main boardroom, watching their every move on a massive high-definition security monitor mounted to the wall. Elias stood beside me, adjusting his cuffs, equally mesmerized by the spectacular display of unwarranted arrogance unfolding on the screen. The lobby was deliberately designed to intimidate. It featured black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a dizzying view of the Seattle skyline, and minimalist, sharp-angled furniture that offered zero comfort. Behind a sleek obsidian reception desk sat a highly trained corporate liaison. She had been instructed by Elias to offer them no hospitality and no deference. My mother immediately marched up to the desk, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble. She crossed her arms, letting her diamond bracelets clash together, and glared at the young woman behind the monitor. "The climate control in this building is absolutely abysmal," Patricia snapped, her voice dripping with extreme irritation. "It feels like a meat locker in here. Adjust the thermostat immediately and have someone bring me a glass of imported sparkling water with lemon. Not tap water. Do you understand? Please have a seat, ma'am." "The executives are concluding a meeting," the receptionist replied in a flat, robotic tone, completely ignoring the demand for water and temperature control. My father, deeply offended by the lack of groveling, stepped up beside his wife. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the authority of a billionaire corporate titan, entirely forgetting that his net worth was currently a massive negative number. "Do you have any idea who we are?" Richard demanded, leaning heavily on the obsidian desk. "I play golf with senators and federal banking regulators. We received a highly disrespectful summons from your compliance department, and I am here to personally straighten out your middle management. Tell your superiors that if they keep me waiting another 5 minutes, I will move my entire corporate portfolio to a competing firm and have this entire floor fired for incompetence." I watched the monitor, letting out a sharp, incredulous laugh. My father was threatening to withhold a portfolio that currently consisted of $0 and staggering fraud charges. It was a masterclass in psychological denial. Behind my parents, Jamal Washington was completely failing to maintain his composure. Despite his aggressive pep talk at the house, the physical reality of the Vanguard headquarters was clearly suffocating him. He paced back and forth across the black marble floor, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly with each sharp turn. He was trying desperately to project the image of a fearless, untouchable hedge fund manager, but his body language betrayed absolute terror. A thick sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the harsh overhead lighting. He kept reaching up to loosen his silk tie, pulling at his collar, as if the room was running out of oxygen. He aggressively checked his heavy gold Rolex every 10 seconds, a nervous tick that signaled his impending panic. He knew the margin calls were hitting his accounts. He knew his funds were frozen. He knew he was standing on the precipice of federal prison, yet he refused to drop the act. Unable to handle the quiet, imposing atmosphere of the waiting room, Jamal suddenly stopped pacing and stormed over to the reception desk. He slammed his hand flat against the marble surface, startling both my parents. "Listen to me," Jamal barked at the receptionist, his voice cracking slightly with suppressed hysteria. "My time is literally worth thousands of dollars a minute. I run the Washington Apex Fund. I do not sit in waiting rooms for anonymous paper pushers. You go into that boardroom right now and tell whatever low-level bureaucrat is hiding behind that door that Jamal Washington demands to be seen. We are restructuring this debt arrangement today on my terms, or I am walking out that door and taking my capital elsewhere." Brittany rolled her eyes, standing near a massive abstract sculpture and looking at her phone. "This entire building is incredibly tacky," she complained loudly, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear her. "It lacks the warmth of our country club. Honestly, these corporate types have absolutely no taste. I cannot wait to get this ridiculous meeting over with, so we can go to a real restaurant and wash the stench of this place off us." I leaned back in my oversized leather chairman chair inside the boardroom. My fingers steepled together as I observed my older sister. She was clinging to her manufactured superiority with a white-knuckled grip. She had no idea that her credit cards were dead, her mansion was in the final stages of foreclosure, and the designer dress she was currently wearing was essentially unpaid for. They were all performing a play to an empty theater. They believed that if they acted rich enough, angry enough, and entitled enough, reality would somehow bend to their will. It was the exact same tactic they had used to break me down for my entire life. If I raised a concern, they shouted over me. If I pointed out an unfairness, they insulted my clothes or my career until I backed down. But Vanguard Trust was not a terrified young girl seeking her parents' approval. Vanguard Trust was an unfeeling, unforgiving financial machine, and I was the one holding the controls. I intentionally made them wait in that lobby for a full 15 minutes, letting the silence and the cold atmosphere chip away at their fake bravado. I watched Jamal wipe the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. I watched my father frantically check his phone for updates from his locked bank accounts. I watched my mother shivering in her expensive blazer, furious that the receptionist refused to acknowledge her demands. They were completely stripped of their actual power, left with nothing but loud voices and empty threats. I glanced at the digital clock on the boardroom wall. It flashed exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The legal grace period was officially over. It was time to pull the curtain down on their little performance. I looked up at Elias, who was standing by the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom. He caught my eye and gave a slow, respectful nod. I gave him the signal. Elias reached out and grasped the polished brass handles. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he pulled the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The sudden noise echoed loudly across the quiet marble lobby, instantly silencing my family's arrogant complaints. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal all froze, turning their heads toward the imposing entrance. Elias stepped out into the lobby, his posture rigid and commanding. He looked directly at the four of them, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "The chief executive officer will see you now." My family hesitated for a fraction of a second in the lobby. I watched through the glass walls of the boardroom as they exchanged confused, irritated glances. They had prepared themselves for a battle with an anonymous corporate titan, some silver-haired billionaire they could manipulate or charm into giving them what they wanted. They squared their shoulders, lifting their chins in that signature Carmichael display of unwarranted superiority, and marched through the heavy mahogany doors. Jamal led the pack. He strutted into the room with the aggressive swagger of a man who owned the world, completely ignoring the fact that his bank accounts were entirely frozen. He adjusted his silk tie, projecting a hollow confidence. Right behind him, my father marched with heavy, entitled steps, his face set in a stern scowl meant to intimidate whoever was sitting at the end of the table. My mother and Brittany followed their designer heels clicking in perfect arrogant unison against the polished hardwood floor. They did not look at the head of the table immediately. They were too busy taking in the sheer scale of the Vanguard Trust boardroom. It was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire room, offering a staggering, uninterrupted view of the Seattle skyline and the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound. A massive 50-foot table made of seamless smoked glass dominated the space. It was a room explicitly designed to make visitors feel incredibly small. I sat at the very head of that table, perfectly silhouetted against the stormy gray sky behind me. I was no longer wearing the cheap charcoal blazer Jamal had openly mocked just 3 days ago at his flashy party. I was wearing a razor-sharp bespoke midnight blue designer suit that commanded absolute authority. My hair was styled in a sleek, uncompromising cut. I rested my elbows on the thick glass, my fingers steepled together under my chin, my posture radiating the absolute terrifying stillness of an apex predator waiting for its prey to step firmly into the trap. As my family reached the midpoint of the long table, Jamal finally shifted his gaze from the skyline to the chairman's seat. The swagger completely vanished from his stride. He stopped so abruptly that my father nearly collided with his back. The sequence of their reactions was a breathtaking symphony of cognitive dissonance. Their brains simply could not process the visual information their eyes were sending them. They had spent 33 years cementing my identity as the pathetic, boring, low-level number cruncher who was meant to sit near the catering kitchen and be grateful for scraps. Seeing me sitting in the ultimate seat of power flanked by billions of dollars in corporate infrastructure literally broke their understanding of reality. My mother was the first to physically react. All the strength left her hands. The heavy gold-clasped designer handbag she had been clutching like a shield slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, violent thud that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous boardroom. She did not even look down at it. Her jaw hung open, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Brittany froze beside her. The condescending smirk she had worn into the room melted away, leaving her face slack and pale. She stared at my tailored suit, her materialistic brain instantly calculating its astronomical cost, and the sheer impossibility of the moment paralyzed her completely. Jamal let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a nervous, erratic sound that betrayed his mounting panic. He looked around the massive boardroom, scanning the corners as if searching for hidden cameras or a television crew. He looked at Elias, who had quietly stepped into the room and closed the mahogany doors behind them, sealing them inside. "Okay," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly as he forced another laugh. "Very funny. Good prank. Did you bribe a security guard to let you sneak in here, Cassidy? You really had us going for a second. Now get out of the way before the actual executives get here. We have a multi-million-dollar restructuring deal to negotiate." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on his sweating face, my expression completely unreadable. My father stepped around Jamal, his shock rapidly morphing into his default state of aggressive indignation. He marched closer to the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "What in the world are you doing in this building?" Richard demanded, his voice booming with forced authority. "Get out of that chair right now, Cassidy. You are going to ruin this negotiation for us. I do not know how you found out we were having a meeting here, but this childish stunt is going to get you arrested for trespassing. Get up." I slowly lowered my hands, placing my palms flat against the cool smoked glass of the boardroom table. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of the fear they had always expected from me. "I am not going anywhere, Richard," I stated clearly. "And why is that?" my father yelled, slamming his hand down on the glass table. "Why are you sitting in the CEO's chair?" "Because Grandpa left the company to the only person in this family who actually knows how to read a balance sheet," I replied. The words struck them like physical blows. The color completely drained from my father's face. He staggered back half a step, shaking his head in aggressive denial. "That is impossible," Richard sputtered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "He left you a phone number. He left us the commercial buildings and the cash. We saw the will. You got nothing. He left you heavily mortgaged brick and mortar to distract your bottomless greed," I corrected smoothly. "He left me the Vanguard Trust, the shadow holding company that quietly purchased every single one of your secret secondary mortgages over the last 10 years. He left me the keys to your financial cage." Jamal's hands began to shake violently. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together in his mind with devastating force. He looked at me, then at Elias, the realization crushing the breath out of his lungs. "You," Jamal choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are Vanguard. You are the external entity." I offered him a cold, terrifying smile. "I am Vanguard Jamal. When the bank manager threw you out of his office on Monday morning, he was following my direct orders. When your black card was declined at the boutique, Brittany, that was my authorization. And when your hedge fund accounts were permanently frozen for breach of contract, Jamal, that was me pulling the lever." My mother let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. She clutched her chest, her eyes darting frantically between me and her husband. Elias stepped forward from the shadows near the door. He walked gracefully to the glass table and placed 4 thick black leather binders precisely in front of their empty chairs. "Chief Executive Officer Carmichael is completely accurate," Elias stated, his voice ringing with formal authority. "Vanguard Trust holds the master lien on your commercial high-rises, your residential estate, and all your linked capital. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, your accounts went into total default. You were summoned here today for a mandatory asset liquidation hearing. You are standing in her building and you exist entirely at her mercy." Brittany let out a loud, hysterical sob, finally comprehending that the sister she had mocked and humiliated for 3 decades now held the absolute power to render her homeless. I leaned back in the chairman's leather chair, watching the absolute destruction of their false reality. They had walked into this room as arrogant, untouchable titans. They were now standing before me as completely broken, bankrupt frauds, finally forced to face the exact person they had so cruelly underestimated. "Please take a seat," I offered, gesturing toward the black leather executive chairs lined up along the massive glass table. None of them moved. My father stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. My mother remained pinned against the wall, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Brittany was shaking so violently that her diamond earrings rattled against her neck. Jamal simply stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, trapped between explosive rage and absolute terror. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I simply picked up a small silver remote from the desk and pressed a button. The mechanized blackout blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows smoothly descended, plunging the room into a dramatic twilight. A second button press activated the massive digital screen spanning the entire wall behind me. "Let us begin with the patriarch," I said, tapping the remote. The screen illuminated the dark room with a blinding white light. A complex web of financial charts, property deeds, and glaring red liability columns materialized behind me. "Richard, for the last 10 years you have been funding Patricia's country club lifestyle and Brittany's luxury allowances by treating Grandpa's commercial high-rises as your personal piggy bank," I stated, using my father's first name to strip away any remaining illusion of family hierarchy. "You took out 5 separate mezzanine loans against those properties, using obscure shell companies to hide the paper trail from the rest of the family. You thought you were brilliant, but you forgot one basic rule of finance. Debt always demands to be paid." I tapped the remote, highlighting a specific terrifyingly large cell on the spreadsheet. "The combined appraised value of those 3 buildings is currently $42 million. I explained, my voice echoing off the glass walls. However, your consolidated debt, including the compound interest you have been completely ignoring for a decade, sits at exactly $58 million. You do not have a $5 million cash inheritance. You have a $16 million deficit. Mathematically speaking, the clothes you are currently wearing are financed by money you do not have. Your entire net worth is less than zero. Patricia turned to Richard, her hands shaking violently. "You told me those loans were paid off," she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure shattering into a million pieces. "You told me we owned those buildings free and clear. You told me we were rich." Richard could not even look at his wife. He stared at the hardwood floor, his face a portrait of absolute crushing defeat. His shoulders slumped, and the imposing, arrogant father figure who had terrorized me for decades completely vanished, replaced by a broke, pathetic old man. I did not give them time to process the destruction. I tapped the remote again, and the screen shifted from Richard's mortgages to a highly stylized glossy document. "Jamal," I said, my voice cutting through my mother's quiet sobbing. "Let us examine the Washington Apex Fund prospectus you were handing out like candy to your investors on Friday night." Jamal puffed out his chest, desperately clinging to his aggressive alpha male persona. "You do not understand those projections, Cassidy. That is elite venture capital structuring. You are a low-level clerk. You are completely out of your depth." I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifying smile. "Elite venture capital structuring," I repeated softly. "That is a fascinating term for blatant, premeditated wire fraud." I tapped the remote. The screen zoomed in on the EBITDA column of his prospectus. "You inflated your projected earnings by 40% using non-existent historical data. But your fatal mistake was the liabilities column. You deliberately omitted Vanguard Trust's $58 million primary lien on your collateral. You pitched those buildings to 50 federally insured investors as unencumbered assets. That is a federal crime, Jamal, and you committed it on a microphone in front of a room full of witnesses." Jamal took a heavy step forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You cannot prove any of that. You are just a bitter, jealous little girl trying to scare us with fake spreadsheets. You have no actual proof of intent. You are bluffing." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass table. "No proof of intent?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let us talk about what happened last night at exactly 9:47 in the evening from your corner office." I tapped the remote one final time. The screen flashed bright crimson, displaying a highly encrypted data log complete with IP addresses, MAC routing numbers, and a $10 million transaction receipt. Jamal stopped breathing. His eyes bulged as he stared at the screen, the color completely draining from his face. "When the banks froze your accounts yesterday morning, you panicked," I stated, dealing the final lethal blow. "You realized your margin calls were going to expose your fraudulent prospectus today. So you logged into your client trust portal. You manually overrode 3 separate internal compliance warnings using your executive credentials. And you illegally wired $10 million of your investors' retirement funds to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." "That is a lie," Jamal screamed, spit flying from his lips. He slammed both hands onto the glass table, leaning toward me with a look of pure, cornered panic. "You hacked my computer. You planted that data. You are bluffing. You have absolutely nothing. You bounced the funds through a Caribbean tax haven," I continued, my voice entirely unfazed by his screaming. "You intended to route it back to your domestic accounts to cover your shortfall before the morning bell. You thought you were untraceable. But I am a forensic accountant, Jamal. I do not just look at the numbers. I follow the digital footprints. I mirrored your entire transaction in real time. I captured your keystrokes, your override codes, and the exact second you clicked execute. I built a pristine, undeniable chain of evidence. You did not just commit a crime. You handed me the murder weapon with your fingerprints perfectly preserved on the handle." Jamal was hyperventilating now, taking short, ragged gasps of air. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her designer dress pooling around her as the reality of her husband's impending imprisonment finally crushed her. Richard and Patricia were completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the devastation. "You are bluffing!" Jamal roared again, his voice cracking with absolute raw desperation. "You are a nobody. You cannot do this to me. I am Jamal Washington." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached under the thick glass lip of the boardroom table and pressed a small concealed silver button. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. Jamal spun around his chest, heaving. Two men in dark conservative suits walked into the room. They moved with a rigid tactical efficiency that immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the space. The man on the left reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold badge, holding it up for Jamal to see. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division," the agent stated, his voice flat and authoritative. "Jamal Washington, you are under arrest." The two agents moved with synchronized, unyielding precision, stepping completely into the boardroom and closing the distance toward the head of the glass table. Jamal stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. His brain, which had spent the last decade functioning on pure, unadulterated arrogance, finally short-circuited. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. He bumped hard into the back of his leather chair, nearly knocking it over in his desperate attempt to retreat from the inevitable. "This is a massive mistake," Jamal stammered, raising both his hands in the air as if trying to physically push away the reality of the situation. "You do not understand what is happening here. I am the manager of the Washington Apex Fund. I handle billions in elite corporate assets. You cannot just walk into a private meeting and arrest me based on a spreadsheet some bitter, low-level accountant drew up. She hacked my internal system. She fabricated the entire data log to frame me." The lead FBI agent did not even blink. He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic rattle cut through the tense air of the boardroom. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest, Mr. Washington," the agent stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "It was signed by a federal judge less than an hour ago based on real-time transactional evidence intercepted by the Financial Crimes Unit. Place your hands behind your back immediately." Panic finally overrode Jamal's instinct for self-preservation. He spun away from the approaching agents, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He pointed a violently shaking finger at my father, who was still paralyzed with shock on the other side of the room. "It is his fault," Jamal roared, his voice echoing violently off the floor to ceiling glass windows. "Richard gave me those assets. He handed me those 3 commercial high-rises and told me they were completely unencumbered. He lied to me about the equity. He hid the secondary mortgages from everyone. I was just trying to secure a standard bridge loan to launch my new fund and save this family. I am the victim here. Richard set me up to take the fall for his massive debts. Arrest him instead. He is the one you want." My father staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. "You arrogant fool," Richard shouted back, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of panic and betrayal. "Do not you dare try to pin your illegal wire transfers on me. I never told you to steal $10 million from your own clients. You did that all on your own because you are a pathetic, incompetent fraud who got caught playing a game you could not win." "I set you up!" Jamal shrieked, taking a menacing, aggressive step toward my father. The FBI agents immediately moved to intercept him. "You handed me toxic garbage and expected me to spin it into gold. I was just trying to save this pathetic family from total bankruptcy." The agents had heard enough. The lead agent lunged forward, grabbing Jamal firmly by the shoulder and spinning him around with brutal efficiency. Jamal let out a startled yelp as the agent shoved him face first against the polished surface of the smoked glass boardroom table. The loud thud of his chest hitting the thick glass sent a physical shockwave of terror through my mother and sister. "Get your hands off me!" Jamal screamed, thrashing his shoulders wildly in a futile attempt to break free from the firm grip. "You do not know who I am. I will sue this entire department. I will have your badges for this. I will ruin your careers." The second agent grabbed Jamal's wrists, forcing them firmly and painfully behind his back. The sharp mechanical click of the steel handcuffs locking into place was the most beautiful, definitive sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the absolute sound of accountability. "Jamal Washington, The lead agent stated, his voice calm, steady, and relentless over Jamal's continuous screaming. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of protected client funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Brittany, who had been sitting on the floor in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly snapped back to reality. Seeing her untouchable wealthy husband pinned against a boardroom table and handcuffed in a federal raid completely broke her fragile materialistic psyche. No, Brittany shrieked a sound so high-pitched and guttural it barely sounded human. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling over the hem of her expensive designer dress. "You cannot take him away. He is a hedge fund manager. We are rich. We have a mega mansion on Mercer Island. We have a yacht. You cannot arrest people like us." She lunged toward the FBI agents, her hands extended like claws, but Elias stepped seamlessly into her path. He did not touch her, but his imposing presence and cold, unyielding glare forced her to stop dead in her tracks. "Please," Brittany sobbed, falling to her knees right in front of Elias. She looked from the federal agents to Jamal, and finally, desperately, she looked up at me. "Cassidy, please, tell them to stop. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. If he goes to prison, the banks will take everything. They will take the cars, the house, the country club memberships. I do not know how to work. I do not have a job. I will have absolutely nothing left. Please, I am your sister." I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, looking down at the weeping, pathetic woman who had spent my entire life making sure I felt worthless. "You should have thought about your lack of employment before your husband decided to steal $10 million. I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "The lifestyle you thought made you better than me is officially dead, Brittany. The illusion is over. You are going to have to learn how to exist in the real world now." The agents pulled Jamal up from the glass table. His custom-tailored suit was severely wrinkled, his expensive silk tie was askew, and his face was a portrait of total devastation. He did not fight them anymore. The reality of the cold steel around his wrists had finally drained the fight completely out of his body. He looked at me one last time, a silent, terrified realization in his eyes that he had brought this entire catastrophe down upon his own head by underestimating the wrong woman. The agents marched him toward the back of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and they dragged the former golden boy of Wall Street out into the hallway. The doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the room in a sudden, suffocating silence. Brittany remained on the floor, weeping loudly into her hands, mourning the permanent death of her social status and her fabricated wealth. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the reckoning in this room was far from over. I slowly turned my leather chair, pivoting my cold, calculated gaze away from the mahogany doors and directing it straight toward the far wall. Richard and Patricia were standing there, huddled together, shaking with unadulterated terror. The apex predator had just eliminated the loudest threat in the room, and now my complete and undivided attention was focused entirely on my parents. The echo of the heavy mahogany doors closing behind the federal agents left a profound vacuum in the massive boardroom. I kept my hands steepled on the cool glass desk, allowing the crushing silence to stretch and wrap around my parents like a tightening vice. Richard and Patricia Carmichael, the undisputed king and queen of their superficial suburban elite, were currently pressed against the far wall of my office. Their designer clothes suddenly looked like cheap costumes hanging off frightened, hollowed-out frames. My father's jaw was trembling uncontrollably. My mother's perfectly manicured hands were clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and frantic. I did not say a single word. I simply watched them process the undeniable fact that the daughter they had treated like an embarrassing burden for 33 years was now the undisputed architect of their total destruction. The psychological weight of their bankruptcy finally severed the invisible strings holding up their pride. My father's knees physically buckled. It was not a calculated move or a theatrical display. His legs simply gave out under the crushing gravity of $16 million in debt and the realization that his entire life was a fraud. He hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the wood. Seeing her husband collapse, Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched wail and dropped to her knees right beside him. The visual of my arrogant, wealth-obsessed parents literally kneeling on the floor of my corporate boardroom was jarring, yet I felt absolutely zero pity in my chest. Patricia crawled a few inches forward, her tear-streaked face turned up toward me. "Cassidy, please," she begged, her voice a desperate, unrecognizable squeak. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take the house and the cars. We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We will have absolutely nothing. We will be homeless. You have to show us some mercy. We are your family." I slowly unsteepled my fingers and rested my palms flat against the pristine surface of the table. I leaned forward, letting my gaze pierce directly through her manufactured tears. "Mercy," I repeated, making sure the word sounded as foreign and repulsive as it truly was to them. "That is a fascinating concept coming from you, Mother. Let us talk about mercy. Where was your mercy on Tuesday morning at the estate lawyer's office?" I stood up from my executive chair and began a slow, deliberate pace around the edge of the glass table. Elias remained perfectly still by the door, a silent sentinel watching the execution. "When the lawyer handed me a single yellowed envelope instead of a check, you did not show mercy," I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "When Jamal laughed in my face and told me that Grandpa left me the phone number to a homeless shelter, you did not correct him. You sat there drinking expensive champagne and told me not to ruin your celebration with my bad attitude. You reveled in my humiliation. You fed on it." I stopped pacing right in front of them, looking down at their trembling, kneeling forms. "You threw me out of your world because I refused to be a vapid, gold-digging socialite," I continued relentlessly. "You demanded I take out crippling personal loans to fund a steakhouse dinner celebrating my own disinheritance. You locked me in a study just yesterday and threatened to destroy my professional career with a fabricated lawsuit if I did not sign over the deed to my only home. You were perfectly willing to render me destitute to save your fraudulent empire." Richard tried to speak, raising a shaking hand toward me. "We were desperate, Cassidy. We were trying to protect our legacy. We thought Jamal could fix the market shortfall." "Your legacy is built on stolen equity and deceit, Richard." I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip across the room. "And now the bill has come due. You want to invoke the title of parents to save your skin, but you never acted like parents. You acted like parasites. You told me to find a homeless shelter just 3 days ago. I suggest you take your own advice. The Vanguard Trust will take full possession of your estate by the end of the business day. You have until 5 o'clock to pack whatever fits into your car before my security teams change the locks." The finality of my words crushed whatever sliver of hope they had left. Patricia collapsed against Richard, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably into his jacket. They were broken, entirely stripped of their power and their dignity, but the drama in the room was not quite finished. A sudden sharp movement caught my eye. Brittany had pushed herself up from the floor near the corner of the room. Her husband had just been hauled off to a federal penitentiary, her sister had just evicted her parents, and her entire world was actively burning to the ground. Yet the toxic entitlement hardwired into her brain simply refused to die. It overrode her grief entirely. She wiped her smeared makeup with the back of her trembling hand and marched up to the glass table. Her eyes narrowed with a desperate, greedy light that made my stomach turn. "Fine," Brittany spat, her voice trembling but defiant. "Jamal is gone and Mom and Dad are broke. But Grandpa left this company to you, which means it is family money. I am his granddaughter too. If Vanguard Trust controls all these billions, then I am legally entitled to a portion of the equity. I want my share of the trust right now. Cut me a check, Cassidy. Give me my half and I will walk out of here and never bother you again." I looked at my older sister, absolutely mesmerized by the boundless depths of her delusion. She was demanding a massive cash payout from the very entity that was currently repossessing her life. She still believed the universe owed her a luxury existence simply because she was born. I walked back to my desk and picked up a thick stack of heavy legal documents that Elias had prepared earlier that morning. I walked back around the table and slammed the paperwork down directly in front of her. The sharp smack made her flinch. "You want your share of the Vanguard Trust?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Here it is, Brittany." She looked down at the paperwork, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" she demanded. "Those are the asset relinquishment and foreclosure documents for your Mercer Island mega mansion, your luxury vehicles, and every single piece of jewelry purchased with Jamal's fraudulent funds," I stated coldly. "Sign them." Brittany stared at the thick stack of legal papers, as if I had just placed a live explosive on the glass table. She shook her head rapidly, her meticulously styled hair coming undone. "I will not sign anything," she spat, pushing the documents back toward me with trembling hands. "Jamal's business has nothing to do with me. I am an innocent spouse. You cannot legally take my home or my jewelry. I will hire my own lawyers and drag you through court for decades. I want my half of Grandpa's trust. Cassidy and I am not leaving until I get a check." I let out a slow, deliberate breath. The sheer persistence of her entitlement was staggering. She was standing in the epicenter of a financial nuclear blast, yet she still believed she could demand a parting gift. Before I could verbally dismantle her delusion, my father suddenly scrambled up from the floor. Richard leaned heavily against the edge of the boardroom table. He completely ignored his sobbing wife and his ruined older daughter. Survival instincts had finally overridden his shock. "Cassidy," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperate negotiation. "Jamal is the criminal here. He committed the wire fraud. He over-leveraged the commercial high-rises. You have him. Vanguard has the assets to cover his debt, but you do not need to take our residential estate. Leave your mother and me the primary house and my personal investment portfolios. I will sign whatever you want regarding Jamal's mess, but you have to leave my personal wealth intact." I looked at my father, utterly disgusted by his willingness to throw his golden child's husband under the bus while begging for his own salvation. "Your personal wealth," I repeated, letting the words hang in the cold air of the boardroom. "Richard, your personal wealth is a complete fabrication built on a decade of federal tax evasion." Richard froze. The pathetic bargaining expression on his face instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated terror. "I am a forensic accountant," I reminded him, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "When I audited the Vanguard Trust databases last night, I did not just look at your secondary mortgages. I looked at the routing numbers for the shell companies you used to obscure those loans. I traced the capital flow. For the last 11 years, you have been funneling taxable corporate income through a labyrinth of offshore holding entities based in the British Virgin Islands. You artificially inflated your domestic business losses to dodge millions in corporate taxes, and then you secretly wired the untaxed profits back into your domestic accounts disguised as foreign investment returns." "That is a lie," my father whispered, though his violently shaking hands told a completely different story. "It is a highly documented fact," I corrected smoothly. "It is a classic sloppy layering scheme. You used a firm in Panama to act as the registered agent for your ghost companies, falsely claiming administrative deductions that completely zeroed out your domestic tax liabilities. You thought creating multiple nested LLCs would shield you from a standard internal revenue audit. I have compiled a comprehensive 70-page forensic report detailing every single illegal offshore transfer you made since I was in high school. I have the account numbers, the date stamps, and the exact sums of evaded tax revenue. I even mapped the IP addresses you used to authorize the transfers from your home office." Patricia let out another horrifying shriek, burying her face in her hands. She finally understood that there was absolutely no escape. Their entire existence was trapped in my crosshairs. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division would consider this an absolute slam dunk case, I continued relentlessly. If I press the send button on my server, that audit goes directly to a federal prosecutor. You will not just lose your house, Richard. You will lose your freedom. You will spend the rest of your miserable life sitting in a federal penitentiary right next to your beloved son-in-law. I tapped the heavy stack of asset relinquishment forms resting on the table. "You have exactly 2 options." I stated my tone, offering zero room for negotiation. "Option 1. You refuse to sign. I send the tax evasion audit to the IRS immediately, and you go to prison for the next 20 years. Option 2. You sign these documents right now. You legally surrender the commercial high-rises, the suburban residential estate, your luxury vehicles, and every single cent in your domestic investment portfolios to Vanguard Trust to satisfy your outstanding debts. You walk out of this building with nothing but the clothes on your back, but you get to keep your freedom. My father stared at the pen resting beside the documents. He looked at me, searching my face for any hint of hesitation, any lingering trace of the obedient daughter he used to bully. He found absolutely nothing. I was a fortress of ice. His shoulders slumped in total defeat. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the gold pen. He did not say another word. He bent over the glass table and began to sign his name. He signed away the sprawling mansion where I was raised. He signed away his imported sports cars. He signed away the commercial buildings he had boasted about just 3 days ago. With every stroke of the pen, he legally erased his status, his wealth, and his identity. When he finished, he dropped the pen and backed away from the table, looking like a hollow shell of a human being. I turned my gaze to Brittany. "Your turn," I commanded. Brittany looked at her father, desperately hoping he would step in and save her. But Richard just stared at the floor, completely broken. She realized nobody was coming to rescue her. The golden child privilege had officially expired. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely hold the gold pen. She looked at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, realizing it no longer belonged to her. Sobbing hysterically, her tears dripping onto the expensive legal paper and smudging the ink, Brittany pressed the pen to the document. She signed the foreclosure agreements for her Mercer Island mega mansion. She relinquished her luxury SUVs. She signed a sworn affidavit surrendering every piece of jewelry, art, and designer clothing purchased with Jamal's fraudulent capital. She legally rendered herself utterly destitute. I watched them closely as they finished the paperwork. They had entered this boardroom believing they were untouchable royalty. They were now standing before me as completely bankrupt individuals facing a terrifying reality. They had no homes, no cars, no credit, and absolutely no power. They had spent my entire life taking everything from me, and now in a matter of minutes, I had legally stripped them of everything they valued. Elias stepped forward and silently collected the signed documents. He verified the signatures with a quick professional glance before securing them inside his leather briefcase. The Vanguard Trust had officially collected its debts. Patricia looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, her voice cracking with raw panic. "We have no money. We have nowhere to sleep tonight." I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. "I hear the city has several excellent homeless shelters," I replied coldly. "You should probably hurry. The beds fill up fast when it rains." I reached under my desk and pressed a secondary button. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. 4 towering Vanguard security guards stepped into the room, their expressions uniformly severe and uncompromising. My family shrank back against the wall, terrified by the sudden arrival of the enforcement team. They looked at me, their faces completely stripped of the toxic arrogance they had worn for decades. I stood up from the chairman's chair, smoothing the lapels of my designer suit. I looked at the people who had abused me, mocked me, and discarded me. I felt absolute total liberation. I turned to the lead security guard and delivered my final command. "Escort these strangers out of my building." 6 months passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Vanguard Trust boardroom closed on my former family. I spent that half-year aggressively restructuring my grandfather's legitimate assets, pruning the dead weight of my father's toxic loans, and solidifying my position as the head of an empire. But while my life ascended into a realm of quiet, unshakable stability, the people who had terrorized me for 3 decades were experiencing a very different kind of trajectory. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing its scales, and the karma my family faced was as precise as a forensic audit. Jamal Washington's criminal trial was short and brutally efficient. The digital evidence I had routed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation was absolute and undeniable. There were no loopholes, no clever defense strategies, and no expensive lawyers to save him because his assets remained entirely frozen by my legal team. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who took one look at my pristine time-stamped data logs and advised Jamal to plead guilty. Jamal stood before a federal judge wearing an oversized faded orange jumpsuit that completely swallowed his former Wall Street arrogance. The judge showed zero leniency for a man who had intentionally stolen retirement funds to fuel his own vanity and cover his massive debts. Jamal was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal system. He went from sipping $200 bourbon in glass-walled corner offices to eating off partitioned metal trays in a maximum security cafeteria. The man who had mocked my salary and told me my brain could not handle big boy math was now making 12 cents an hour scrubbing prison toilets. With Jamal locked away and her illicit assets completely repossessed by Vanguard Trust, Brittany experienced a catastrophic fall from grace. She had never worked a single day in her life, having coasted entirely on our parents' money and her husband's fraudulent wealth. Reality hit her like a speeding freight train. Today, my older sister works as a cashier at a cheap 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. The hands that used to flaunt massive diamond rings are now cracked dry and blistered from wiping down greasy tables and running a sticky cash register. She rents a tiny windowless studio apartment located directly over a loud laundromat. She struggles every single month just to make her minimum rent payment. I occasionally receive reports from my security team about her whereabouts. She spends her breaks sitting on a milk crate in the alley behind the diner, scrolling through old photos on her cracked phone, desperately clinging to the ghost of a luxury lifestyle that never truly belonged to her. The sister who once told me to go work at a coffee shop is now permanently trapped serving stale drip coffee to angry truck drivers who snap their fingers at her for extra napkins. As for my parents, their descent was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. When I legally seized their residential estate and liquidated their domestic portfolios to cover their massive fraudulent debts, they were left with absolutely nothing. The people they had spent decades trying to impress abandoned them overnight. Their elite country club revoked their membership the very second their annual dues bounced. The wealthy friends they had cultivated for years immediately stopped taking their calls, treating them like a highly contagious disease. Without their money, Richard and Patricia Carmichael were entirely worthless to the high society circle they worshipped. They now live in a cramped, rusting, double-wide trailer in a rundown park 40 miles outside the city limits. The space is so small, they can barely walk past each other without bumping shoulders. My father, who used to boast about playing golf with senators and federal regulators, now spends his days sitting in a cheap plastic lawn chair, on a patch of dead grass, drinking cheap canned beer, and arguing with the trailer park manager over late utility bills. My mother, who used to mock my clothing and demand imported sparkling water from frightened receptionists, now clips coupons from the Sunday paper and buys her wardrobe from discount clearance bins at local thrift stores. They are entirely isolated, trapped in a tiny metal box, with nothing but their mutual resentment and their crushing poverty to keep them company. They turned on each other almost immediately, spending their days screaming about whose fault it was that they lost their empire. Some people might expect me to feel a twinge of sadness for them. Society conditions us to believe that blood is thicker than water, that family deserves endless forgiveness, no matter how severe the abuse. But as I sit in my penthouse office, looking at the pristine financial reports of my thriving companies, I feel absolutely zero guilt. I feel no remorse. I feel no lingering attachment. Oh, I did not destroy their lives. I simply stopped shielding them from the consequences of their own actions. My father chose to commit federal tax evasion and hide secondary mortgages. Jamal chose to commit wire fraud and steal from his own clients. My mother and sister chose to actively participate in the emotional and financial abuse of the only person who actually tried to earn an honest living. They dug their own graves with shovels made of pure greed, weaponized arrogance, and relentless cruelty. I merely handed them the headstones. As a forensic accountant, my entire worldview is based on the concept that every ledger must eventually balance. You cannot carry massive liabilities forever without the equation correcting itself. My family spent 33 years taking from me, borrowing against my sanity, my self-worth, and my peace of mind. The foreclosure of their lives was simply the universe balancing the books. I sleep perfectly every single night, knowing that they earned their exact consequences. I sit behind the massive custom-built desk in the Vanguard Trust penthouse office, the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy glass table from the boardroom is just a few doors down, a permanent monument to the day my life fundamentally changed. The past 6 months have been the most demanding, exhilarating period of my entire professional career. When I initially took control of my grandfather's empire, it was actively bleeding from the arterial wounds inflicted by my father's secret mortgages and Jamal's fraudulent leverage. I did not panic. I simply went to work with the cold precision of a surgeon. I spent countless nights running deep forensic audits, aggressively liquidating the toxic assets they had accumulated and systematically restructuring the corporate debt. I sold off the commercial high-rises to a highly reputable commercial development firm, taking a calculated, strategic loss to instantly clear the Vanguard balance sheets of the crippling secondary mortgages my family had generated. I purged the redundant holding companies, dissolved the offshore shell entities in Panama and the British Virgin Islands, and stabilized the core investments that actually generated sustainable, legitimate revenue. My grandfather's empire is no longer a precarious house of cards balancing on deceit and vanity. It is a formidable fortress of clean, unencumbered capital, yielding higher quarterly profits than it ever did when my family was recklessly siphoning funds for country club dues and luxury cars. I pick up a heavy gold pen from my desk. It is not the same gold pen my father used to sign away his life under duress. It is my own purchase to celebrate my first legitimate corporate acquisition as Chief Executive Officer. Today, I am using it to authorize something far more important than a standard real estate transaction. Resting on my immaculate desk is a binding legal charter for a massive philanthropic initiative. I press the nib to the paper and sign my name with a smooth, decisive stroke, officially funding an initial $30 million grant to establish the Carmichael Foundation for Financial Justice. The mission of this organization is simple but entirely unprecedented in the corporate sector. We will provide free top-tier forensic accounting and elite legal representation to victims of financial abuse and corporate fraud. We will actively hunt down predatory hedge fund managers, abusive spouses, hiding marital assets, and corrupt executives who use complex spreadsheets to steal from the vulnerable. I know exactly how it feels to be financially manipulated, gaslit, and emotionally blackmailed by people who hold all the power. I survived because I had the specialized education and the relentless drive to fight back. Now I am weaponizing my vast capital to ensure that people who lack those critical resources will never have to face financial predators alone. I am turning the very wealth my family tried to use as a weapon into an impenetrable shield for others, especially for elderly individuals targeted by greedy relatives who view them only as walking bank accounts. The heavy oak door to my office clicks open. Elias Thorne walks in, his posture as impeccable as ever, holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee from the premium espresso machine in the executive lounge. He sets one down on my desk, right next to the newly signed foundation charter. He looks at the signature on the document, his sharp eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine, profound warmth. The Vanguard legal team has already prepared the press release for the foundation launch, Elias says, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The board of directors is entirely finalized, and the initial operating capital has been securely wired to the designated nonprofit accounts. The financial press is going to love the irony of the Carmichael name becoming legally synonymous with corporate accountability and transparency. I smile, sliding the completed charter into a thick leather folder. It is not about the press coverage, Elias. It is about balancing the ledger permanently. It is about making sure that substantial wealth actually serves a purpose beyond buying designer clothes and financing performative luxury. Elias nods slowly, his gaze shifting to the framed photograph of my grandfather resting on the corner of my desk. The picture shows a sharp-eyed, pragmatic man who built everything from the ground up. He took a massive calculated risk when he bypassed your parents and handed this entire financial machine directly to you. Elias notes his voice dropping into a tone of profound, quiet respect. He always told me that Richard knew how to spend an empire into the ground, but Cassidy was the only one who possessed the intellect and the integrity to actually build a lasting legacy. He would be incredibly proud of you today, Chief Executive Officer. Not just for saving the company from total ruin, but for knowing exactly what to do with the ultimate power once you secured it. I thank Elias as he steps out of the office to file the finalized paperwork with our legal department. The room is quiet again, but it is no longer the heavy, suffocating, anxious silence I endured for 33 years in my parents' house. It is the crisp, energized silence of absolute potential and unchallenged authority. I stand up from my desk and walk over to the expansive glass windows. The Seattle skyline stretches out endlessly before me, a brilliant, sprawling tapestry of steel glass and morning sunlight reflecting brilliantly off the deep waters of Puget Sound. From up here in the penthouse, the world does not look intimidating or overwhelming. It looks like a perfectly arranged chessboard, and for the very first time in my life, I am the one moving the pieces. I look down at the busy city streets far below, feeling completely detached from the toxic shadows of my past. The girl who was endlessly mocked for choosing a practical career, the daughter who was cruelly discarded for not fitting into a superficial mold, the sister who was shoved into the corner with the catering staff. That girl is gone forever. I have surgically removed the people who tried to destroy my spirit, and I did it without compromising a single ounce of my personal integrity. My private cell phone rings, breaking the quiet stillness of the executive office. I do not look at the caller ID with dread or anxiety anymore. I know exactly who is calling. It is my lead acquisition attorney reaching out to finalize the terms of a massive multi-million-dollar buyout of a competing financial analytics firm. I take a deep, satisfying breath of the cool, conditioned air. I feel the solid, undeniable weight of my own earned authority settling comfortably into my shoulders. I tap the screen to answer the call, completely free, completely victorious, and ready to reign supreme over my new empire. One profound lesson from this story is that shared blood does not automatically equal true family. When you are constantly diminished, excluded, or abandoned by those who should protect you, the healthiest choice is often to walk away. The protagonist teaches us that our self-worth isn't defined by people who are blind to it. Instead of waiting for validation from toxic relatives, we must find the courage to set firm boundaries, reclaim our independence, and build a life with those who genuinely value us. Have you ever walked away to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.